Dark Souls 1 is a cryptic game at its face, but behind every character storyline you can mess up with one wrong move, every boss that's given no context for and items that seem entirely out of place, is a cohesive story that builds the world of Dark Souls as not just bigger than the events of the main game, but develops a world that is on par with the scale of even Tolkien's Middle-earth. In what is my most ambitious series yet, today's video will explain everything that ever happens in Dark Souls 1, building out the world from before the events of the main game all the way to its end, and in the process we'll explore in every ounce of detail the character stories and the tales of the lands beyond Dark Souls that are hidden in copious amounts of item descriptions and strange dialogue. Everything in this video draws only from the direct text, environmental clues, and contextual information gathered from the game proper, fusing them together to create a timeline of not only the grander events of the game, but even the story that precedes Dark Souls and the story of the characters within them and the regions they hail from, building out the world of Dark Souls far wider than the game itself. Time in Dark Souls is always a contentious topic, and thus there may be events that are outlined as up for interpretation as to when exactly they happened or what they preceded. But with the knowledge we have of the entire Souls series and the countless resources made on the interpretation of its primary sources, I have what I believe is the most comprehensive backlog of information to build out the entire story. Before we start, please take a second out to like, subscribe, and even hype the video so the algorithm gods are kind to me. I'm a one-man army and continue to choose against sponsorships so that these videos feel like true masterpieces in their own right. In any case, thank you for your support and get ready to sit back or even start a new playthrough as I go into the theory of everything for Dark Souls. At the very beginning of the entire Souls universe, prior to the concept of disparity itself, the world was symbolised by stagnation and stasis. This state was represented by undying archtrees and everlasting dragons. It's not entirely necessary to go any further back than this, as the chronology of the Souls series starts here. We aren't given a Tolkien-esque backstory to how the world was created, rather we are told the world was always just there and time itself was an abstract idea, as the Age of Ancients, its inhabitants and even flora were unbound by its proceedings. But there are theories found at the end of the final installment of Dark Souls 3's DLC that posit this world of harmony may be layered in a multiverse of sorts that may have itself emerged from a previous world's natural endpoint. Whether this previous world, like the end of Dark Souls world, was due to a stagnation brought upon its own timeline by a selfish god clinging to an age and tainting the natural progression of its universe is not specified, but could suggest Dark Souls begins in a way not dissimilar to how it ends, in a painting conjured by an entity that sought to preserve its essence in an image that would represent a new universe entirely. Perhaps the painter that created the world of Dark Souls sought to create a world unbound by the pain related to the passages of time, and thus painted a world where time did not exist, a place filled with beings that were unbound by time and thus unbound by the proceedings of natural life. However, whether this was or wasn't the case, we know there was a fatal flaw in the design of this era in time, a fatal flaw represented as the First Flame. Before we speak of the First Flame, it's of course important to speak of the other species of this game's universe. We don't get details on what this species were or represented, or how they differed from the everlasting dragons, outside of the fact that they were humanoid bipedal creatures that too were everlasting and resided deep below Earth. These beings likely knew nothing more than darkness and lay dormant below Earth, not unlike the dormancy of the dragons above the ground. However, the world below the ground was to be shaken deeply by the spontaneous revelation which is only ever referred to as the First Flame. How and why the first flame emerged is anybody's guess, but to harken back to the scenario of the multiversal painter, it may relate to how painters themselves of these universes in the Souls franchise, be that Oriamis or Oriandel, are deeply imperfect beings, and it's likely the portrait they create while seeking for them to represent one thing may have been infected by their own mindset, or perhaps infected by the material used to paint them in the first place. We learn Oriandel, the painting relative to Dark Souls 3, was inflicted by a deep-set rot. This rot natural to what is likely the paint and dye used to create the image. How the first flame fits into this narrative is of course relative to how you view the world of Dark Souls itself. Nevertheless, the fire did emerge, and deeply tied to this fire was a divine command for life in a world that only knew the absence of death. These humanoid beings would find within the first flame souls, souls that promised life, and by definition, death, something to lose and of course, something to gain. Amongst those that behold the first flame were 4 great beings. These 4 beings found immensely powerful souls that shouldered a responsibility to bring life to the world as a whole through a power that held the promise of change. Amongst these 4 was of course Gwyn, told to have gathered the greatest of the souls, the soul of sunlight. Beside Gwyn were Nito, the first of the dead, Izalith, the great witch of fire, and a very special soul unlike the others, the Dark Soul. We'll come back to this later. However, it was not only the great Lord Soul-bearing gods that became enriched in life through the first flame. As we learn, all humanoid beings found souls too, some greater than others, and amongst the greater humanoids were gods and great heroes. In time, Gwyn would organise the now sentient beings under a banner of life, and a military of biblical proportions would be erected, ready to march upon the world to bring the gospel of the first flame into the greater world. It's likely you aren't unfamiliar with the preceding events of this era, but as we now have the context from the complete series, we know the details of this war were far more intense than originally assumed, as it's very likely the initial attempts to undo the Everlasting Dragons spelt an ending for Gwyn's army, and only once seeking counsel from Seath, a pale drake ancient dragon that would betray his own kind, did Gwyn begin to win the upper hand, as he taught Gwyn techniques in stripping his kin of their hides and thus undoing their immortal scales. From this, Gwyn fashioned lightning bolts from his soul of sunlight to act as a bane against the Everlasting Dragons, and his men built their artillery to mimic the properties of Gwyn's lightning to further the cause too. We aren't given an inherent timeline to how prolonged this conflict was, but we do know it would lead to generations of men and women being born into dragon-slaying traditions during this conflict. Some of the great names of the non-Lord Soul-bearing gods were of course the Great Goth, told to have originally shared rank with the regular cadre of Gwyn's army, the Silver Knights, only to be elevated far beyond through his unique use of his Dragonslayer bow, told to be larger than those used by the Silver Knights and exclusively built to reconcile with the strength of this humanoid giant, eventually positioning Goth as the leader of the archery division of the Silver Knights during their Great Crusade. But it wasn't just Goth that stood out, many others did too. During this time, Havel would also find great notoriety, likely beginning his tenure as a Silver Knight, only to quickly climb the ranks due to a variety of decisive victories over the Everlasting Dragons, enough so that Havel would begin to salvage their bodies and construct great weapons and armaments to further the cause, leading to his infamous stone-scaled armour and even his great dragon tooth weapon. Eventually, Havel would win the personal commendation of Gwyn too, with descriptive context suggesting he would rise to Gwyn's personal division of Dragonslayers, acting as his own battlefield compatriot. Havel's actions and proximity to Gwyn during this period is of course canonised in his own miracle spells. As we learn, miracles are not just spells in Dark Souls proper, but rather stories of ancient victories during the construction of the Age of Fire that would be so influential just their retelling would carry transferable strength in themselves. It would naturally be amiss not to mention Gwyn's most fateful champion during this period too, the Nameless King. While we can speculate the name of this great champion, what's most important is that this was Gwyn's firstborn son, told to have carried within his own body a portion of Gwyn's very own sunlight that allowed him to conjure upon lightning spells without the direct recitation of Gwyn's strength through miracles. He was the only other being able to innately conjure sunlight spears. The Nameless King's story, while relevant throughout the timeline of the universe, was, during the War of Ancients, heralded as the single greatest dragon slayer amongst the lesser deities for this reason. So powerful was the Nameless King, a cohort of specialised dragon slayers would rise under his tutelage, a group that would be responsible for creating the infamous Dragon Slayer spears, weapons fashioned from his lightning weapons that would give rise to another great deity, Ornstein. Ornstein would act in parallel to the Great Nameless King, even creating a coven of warriors known as the Warriors of Sunlight, dedicated to acts of camaraderie and nobility, a coven of knights that would be most in tune with the sunlight of the Nameless King, and by proxy his father, Gwyn himself. We'll return to this covenant later on, as it plays a key role in the legacy of both Gwyn and the Nameless King later down the line. I mentioned the great champions of the Age of Ancients to truly put into perspective how large in scale this war was, as even beside the notable characters such as the Four Lords and even great deities such as Goth, Ornstein and the Nameless King, there are thousands of other heroes who would play pivotal roles in this coordinated war for the ages, such as Shira, a bowman with lineage to Gwyn either through his devolved soul in Seath or passed down heritage in Guinevere. Standing as one of few battlefield-hardened women, she drew distinction to the archers of Goth's tutelage through her unique combination of Gwyn's lightning miracles and her bowmanship, creating lightning bow attacks that merged both disciplines. This War of Ancients, even just under Gwyn's arm of the war, was fought on great many fronts. Bowmen, silver knights that drew their blades enhanced with lightning, and even spearmen of Ornstein's legacy all fought with one single North Star of defeating the everlasting dragons, and it's very likely many thousands of heroes of equal or greater distinction died during this war too. But again, this only details Gwyn's arm of the front against dragons. As we know, this battle was far more than just Gwyn's contributions, as the other Lord Soul bearers marched in their own formations too. Much like Gwyn, Izalith also found a great Lord Soul within the First Flame. Her power sat firmly within the ability to manipulate fire, likely sourcing directly from the First Flame itself. Izalith would thus be the first to recognise the inherent tie between Soul and the First Flame. As beings given life through the First Flame, she was able to warp fire into great flame arc storms. An incredibly interesting aspect of her use of her Lord Soul is that she may have been the first to tap into the power of sorcery, as sorcery in its nature was the ability to project the power of great sources of energy into violent projections. While Izalith is told to have harboured the innate ability to warp the First Flame's fire, she would disseminate her own understanding and ability onto what is later referred to as her Daughters of Chaos. Whether biological children or heirs to her great strength, she would form a coven of witches and teach them the art of utilising the fire of the First Flame through staffs, or in other words, catalysts. This use of catalyst is likely where the later sorcerers of Vinheim would seek to capture the power of Seath's crystal sorcery, as crystals in themselves were again derived from the great power of soul from the First Flame, as Seath concocted these spells through Gwyn's devolved Lord Soul given to him as compensation for his act in aiding Gwyn's great crusade against his own kind. Without getting too far ahead of ourselves, Izalith and her daughters would prove to be monumentally impactful in the turning tides of the War of Ancients. Her daughters would rain havoc upon the world, decimating dragons through the projection of the First Flame alongside Izalith herself. While we don't get direct details on the impact of her crusade, it is often accounted as being as relevant as Gwyn's great streaks of lightning. It's likely the canon of her story would be muddied by her later sins. We'll delve into this soon enough. Her flame arcs would singe the battlefield, and her daughters would weave these flames so violently it would burn the scales of the dragons to a crisp. This fire sorcery would go down in history as potentially the most violent form of sorcery ever conceived, likely due to its sourcing of the First Flame during its absolute height of power. Fire sorcery, as we learn, would diminish entirely, partly due to the waning of the First Flame, but mostly due to later Izalith's contributions to the Age of Fire that would warp her essence for good. Leading us to the other great lord of fire, Nito. Nito's a peculiar case, as he's referred to as the first of the dead. There are naturally many theories as to what this meant, but the most confident of these theories suggests upon the world being introduced to disparity through the First Flame, Nito, carrying his newfound great soul of fire, would be first to die a true death under these new conditions. His death would reinforce the notion that the First Flame's emergence was one that gave meaning to life itself by offering death to previously eternal beings. In doing so, Nito's body would conform with those that would die after and amalgamate into the representation of death itself. His power, unlike that of Gwyn or even Izalith, centered around this theme, and thus were projected through miasma and a plague that infected beings from the inside out. During this period, much like Gwyn's knights and Izalith's daughters, a cohort of champions known as the Gravelord Servants would spread Nito's influence through stories of Nito's power, and as they marched upon the dragons rendered scaleless from Gwyn and Izalith's contributions, he would conjure a plague so immensely powerful that it would malform the everlasting dragons at a scale that may even eclipse Izalith's own firestorms. We know this may be the case, as even during our own playthrough we can find everlasting dragons melted and mutated by Nito's plagues, still clutching onto whatever life they could throughout Lordran. These were the three formal fronts of the Great War of Ancients in the great narrator's retelling of these events. However, it is important to remember this narrator may too be unreliable, as she likely speaks from the events as told by Gwyn. We get the most reinforcement of this fact through what we learn much later on in Dark Souls 3 about the Fourth Lord, the Furtive Pygmy, a lord that was no contemporary to Nito or Izalith, rather a contemporary to Gwyn himself, a being that held the Dark Soul. In the Ring City, we learn of beings known as the Ring Knights and the Pygmy Lords, champions that share heritage to this elusive bearer of the Dark Soul. We learn at the precipice of the War of Ancients, a pact may have been made between Gwyn and the Furtive Pygmy that would lead to the Furtive Pygmy aiding in Gwyn's crusade for life, causing the Furtive Pygmy to split its dark soul amongst other beings, creating a class of beings distinct from the gods, a class of beings that would be referred to as pygmies, smaller creatures that source their power not from the First Flame directly, but from the dark soul inherent to the Furtive Pygmy. We don't necessarily know the origins of the Dark Soul itself. It's inferred it was a special fragment of the First Flame found by the Furtive Pygmy, a fragment that promised something different to the fiery souls offered to the gods. It wasn't a promise of life and disparity, rather it was a promise of an age that would precede the Age of Fire, a promise that this pending Age of Fire would one day resemble the stagnant darkness of the Age of Ancients, and a promise that the bearers of this Dark Soul would inherit a new world where the time of the gods would come to an end and a new era would be erected upon their dying vestiges, an era of humans, an era of men. This explains why the Furtive Pygmy is referred to as furtive, the literal meaning relating to the act of being small or secretive. The Furtive Pygmy likely saw the Fiery Lords as a necessary, natural step that would later lay the conditions for its own reign, and the necessity to keep the essence of its power secret to the Fiery Lords for this reason, ready to pounce once the material conditions of the world would mandate a new era of men to emerge. This also helps us understand why the Furtive Pygmy would offer its children in Gwyn's crusade. This alliance was not just symbolic either, it was imperative, as we learn the Pygmy Lords would be absolutely essential in offering another front in defeating the everlasting dragons. These proto-humans would decimate dragons alongside the gods, tearing their visages to use as shields and impaling their flesh with their own weapons. And soon enough, the everlasting dragons would fall, and the Furtive Pygmy would return to its original domicile, awaiting the turn of age where it could re-emerge to take the reign as a lord of this post-Age of Fire era. Gwyn, standing atop the corpses of the everlasting dragons, would, in this moment, declare victory and raise his banner as a sign of a new era, the era known as the Age of Fire. In the following moments after the death of the everlasting dragons, Gwyn would construct the Order of Gods, building Anor Londo, a home for the gods at the height of this society, to dictate its mechanisms. The seats of this new reign likely saw the great Lord Soul-bearing deities given lands of their own. Gwyn himself would situate Anor Londo as the capital of this new era, where he ruled monarchically as a paternal figure. Below him within Anor Londo was a bureaucracy of his influence, made up of prominent figures of the War of Ancients and his children that bear special souls. We learn his second in command would be none other than the great Nameless King, granted the role as a god of war, and likely the head of Anor Londo's military, while Guinevere, his eldest daughter, carried the status as a special religious figurehead. Her iconography would come to represent the peace and resplendent nature of the early moments of the Age of Fire as one of great bounty and fertility. Below her, maidens would share her soothing miracles and enrich the Age of Fire under a healing blanket of warm light and rays of soothing sunlight. Gwyndolin, Gwyn's youngest son, would be raised as a daughter due to his affinity for the moon. The symbolism of the moon would be quite literal, as both a reflection of Gwyn's sunlight, but also the dark side of Gwyn's reign. For this reason, Gwyndolin would be made charge of the Dark Moon Blades, a coven of missionaries that were dutied with covert operations and policing within the royal capital. Gwyn, of course, had another child, Filianor, but we'll save her story for further through the video. Alongside Gwyn's children were the famed champions of the Age of Fire, the deity lords that helped in the construction of Lordran. Of course, none other would be celebrated harder than Seath, the pale drake betrayer that taught Gwyn of the everlasting dragon's weakness. Standing true to his promise, Gwyn would offer a portion of his own Soul of Sunlight for Seath's contributions, and even construct an academy of research beside Anor Londo as his personal domicile, providing an institution for Seath to reconcile the immortality he lacked in comparison to his everlasting peers. Besides Seath, other champions were elevated too, namely Gwyn's famous quartet of knights, including the previously mentioned Goth and Ornstein, but also a gritty champion known as Artorias and the eloquent Kiran. This quartet would act as Gwyn's own roundtable, often given special tasks in the maintenance of the Age of Fire. Ornstein and Goth would be tasked with the continued dragon slaying of the remaining remnants of the everlasting dragons, while Artorias would find a special task in subduing the new rising threat of darkness. We'll detail this further soon enough. And of course Kiran would be commissioned as the leader of the Lord's Blades, a faction not dissimilar to the Darkmoon Blades, but far more specialised to tasks relative to Gwyn himself. This group of women are told to have worked in the dead of night and sought to command terror to those that threatened Gwyn's legitimacy personally. However, Anor Londo, while the capital of this new era, was not the only great territory of the Age of Fire, as many others would rise too, of course with the blessings of the great deity King Gwyn. One of the greater kingdoms was that of Great Izalith, named after the Lord Soul Bearer Izalith herself. After the Crusades' end and adjacent to the creation of Anor Londo, Izalith would find a world deep below Earth to create a godly queendom of her own, as she was a contemporary to Gwyn after all. This land would be known as Great Izalith, close to the source of power the witch and her daughters saw as a deeply holy site and the source of their great strength, this of course being the first flame. Great Izalith would be built around fire sorcery, and while pre-chaos Izalith isn't entirely known to us, it likely revolved around Izalith and the bureaucracy of her witch children. Beside Izalith, of course, was also Nito, the first of the dead. To harken back to the earlier details of Nito, as the first of the dead, he held a deep affinity to those that would die under the new conditions of the Age of Fire. If you remember, the Age of Fire, while celebrating life, was also intrinsically linked to death being a material concept too, thus not to render life as meaningless. This symbiosis worked well for Gwyn, as while he built Anor Londo under the all-encompassing sun, below him deep within the catacombs of Lordran, Nito was the arbiter of those that would die, offering a mass burial site that housed all the fallen heroes of the Age of Ancients, but also all that would die hitherto. Nito's domain would act as a holy site for the Age of Fire for this reason, and his presence ensured proper death was propagated to those within the Age of Fire. This proper death, while at its face was confined to those sent for burial, actually extended far beyond this, as Nito's role would also take on Reaper characteristics, ensuring he would continue bringing death to those in the world when marked through his Gravelord servants that remained intact after the events of the Age of Ancients. This would build a perfect symbiosis in a world of disparity. Life was cherished through the sun and thus Gwyn, the first flame was celebrated through Izalith, and death maintained the relevance of life through Nito. But of course, this isn't the totality of the great souls found, as if we return to the furtive pygmy, the question looms: what was given to the selfless progenitor of humans? Well, in truth, it's likely the furtive pygmy, following the events of the Great War of Ancients, retreated back to his underground domicile where it all began, and remained furtive and waiting for the flames to fade and a chance to rebuild a world under one that unshackled humans from the tutelage of gods, a world where humans were allowed to lead. This explains the furtive pygmy, but what of his children, the pygmy lords and pygmy knights? Well, originally Gwyn, while building a hierarchy that saw gods at the height of this civilization, did end up holding his end of the bargain for humans too. He decorated the pygmies with titles of lordship, with certain degrees of political autonomy, and of course devolved political power. The most notable of this devolution, at least immediately, was the construction of New Londo. Its naming convention and parallels to Anor Londo isn't just semantic either, as it was a kingdom ruled by 4 pygmy lords of direct lineation from the furtive pygmy. It's likely these 4 lords represented an arm of the Great War of Ancients, so powerful it mandated a position amongst gods. However, in order to not muddy the hierarchy of Anor Londo, a city in proximity to Anor Londo was erected and provided domicile for both the pygmy lords and their children. And as a final act of respect to the 4 kings for their contributions during the Age of Ancients, Gwyn would transfer a portion of his Soul of Sunlight to the 4 kings so that they could command real political authority within the Age of Fire. But the contributions of the pygmy race were not solely represented by these 4 kings. They were far and wide, and many pygmies would be lorded within Gwyn's kingdom, leading us to the Ringed City. Despite Gwyn appreciating the efforts of the furtive pygmy, and despite the furtive pygmy holding secret the power of the dark soul from the fiery lords, Gwyn, either from witnessing the absolute power of the dark soul during the War of Ancients, or perhaps feeling within the furtive pygmy a power contemporary to his own, feared the dark soul and feared its bearers, as he may have understood the fickleness of this era, understood the frailty of an age built on a burst of energy destined to die down. And thus, from the earliest moments in the construction of the Age of Fire, Gwyn always held deep antagonisms towards the Dark Soul for this reason. He knew a check and balance would be required in containing the Dark Soul in order for his Age of Fire to transcend the confines of time. Gwyn, despite being a benefactor of revolutionary shifts, equally feared being the victim of such a thing. This mantra would bubble into what Aldir, a scholar of the primordial age found much further in the timeline, would label as the first sin. With this in mind, Gwyn granted the Pygmy Lords a kingdom, a place that both sat under his eyeshot and supervision. He offered these Pygmies crowns and lordship as a gift, but it's more likely it represented a means of control. If Gwyn could isolate the great power of the Dark Soul to a section of the world separated from the Age of Fire proper, he could control it. This may also explain why he granted a portion of his own soul to the 4 kings as a means to de-incentivize rebellion against the Age of Fire. In the Ring City, we can find a statue of Gwyn, garbed in far more modest attire, bequeathing a pygmy a crown. If we land on the statue, we can find a Chloranthy ring, a ring covered in Anor Londo's iconography and an enchantment of the gods, a reminder of the gods' perceived benevolence and the necessity for the pygmies to worship the gods rather than turn in opposition to them, despite their innate antagonisms as beings of the dark. Beings that are due to rebel against fire. So the kingdom thrived isolated in itself, a home for humans, a perceived utopia from what seemed to be the altruism of Gwyn. With all set in motion, Gwyn's kingdom was primed to be magnificent, his order perspectively immortal. Gwyn's kingdom would begin to grow large, with a variety of many different cultures born with the single North Star of worshipping the sun. This time in history is marked with immense peace. In fact, so peaceful was this era that most kingdoms would grow with pacifistic tendencies. The most prime example of this would be Ulasil, a place in tune with nature, an agricultural society that heralded the sun and from which would be birthed an early sorcery tradition that sought to solve non-violent issues. The Ulasil mystics would create spells of light and means of fixing clothing and tools. This era is filled with stories not dissimilar to this, but the first sign of instability within Gwyn's kingdom would be related to sorcery too, specifically the actions being conducted by the great ally Seath in his domicile now known as the Duke's Archives. Seath, perhaps more than most, never found even a degree of peace, as while he was granted dukedom and great commendation under this era, this was built on the death of his kin, a fact he would reconcile in a twisted longing for their eternal scales. For Seath, his goal since betrayal was never about the construction of the Age of Fire, but to claim the immortality he lacked, and thus, if this immortality could never be gained, the sacrifice was for nothing. Even in the early days, Seath was egregious with his experimentation into immortality, famously going out of his way to capture maidens, often religious figures, to torment in his archives under the nose of Gwyn himself. As time went on, more women would be captured, and Seath's experiments grasping more and more of the continent. Gwyn, ever grateful to the Pale Drake, allowed this to happen, but the more orthodox members of the Age of Fire would become abhorred by Seath's endeavours. The most notable, of course, would be none other than Gwyn's own battlefield compatriot, the Great Havel. After the War of Ancients, Havel resigned himself to a small cohort of followers that practiced an orthodox line of faith and the theocratic mechanisms of the Age of Fire. Naturally, this would lead to Havel looking upon Seath, a being that harboured an aspect of Gwyn's own sunlight soul, as a blasphemer, specifically due to his actions against maidens. Havel could only stand Seath's actions for so long, and thus devised a means to eliminate Seath permanently. These actions would begin one of the first rebellions during the Age of Fire, the occult rebellion led by Havel and followed on by many of Havel's companions. In the early days of this rebellion, Havel lay low and even devised a spell, later canonized as a miracle known as the Great Magic Barrier, a bane to sorcery and a necessary asset required to confront a being empowered by the power of Gwyn himself. With defences in order, Havel still required something that could reckon with Seath, as Seath was no ordinary everlasting dragon like the thousands he felled many times over during the Age of Ancients. He was an everlasting dragon empowered by Gwyn's Lord Soul, and thus required measures that could be theoretically turned against Gwyn himself. For this, Havel required the power of the occult. While there are diverging theories about what the occult originates its source of power from, most outright descriptions suggest the occult was a power inherently linked to Gravelord Nito, a fitting place to find it as Nito, a peer to Gwyn and the arbiter of death for gods and human alike, may have held the properties to deal proper death to gods. There are naturally other theories such as those that posit a link to occult armaments and the painted world of Artorias, but Nito feels to make more sense for the previously stated reason, and the fact that it was in the moments of attempting to steal the power of the occult that Havel's plot would be unravelled, and it would be Gwyn himself who would put a stop to Havel's transgressions, likely aided by Nito. And thus, unfortunately for Havel, the occult rebellion would be quashed by Gwyn. However, Gwyn, unable to kill his old friend, would eventually trap him in a tower. The watchtower basement key telling us the basement of the watchtower forms a stone cell. There are rumours of a hero turned hollow who was locked away by a dear friend, suggesting Havel was irreconcilable and Gwyn himself would subdue Havel in the basement where we can find him. While there are community notes around whether Havel in the basement is the one of legend, I believe he absolutely is, as he wields both the Dragon Tooth and Havel's Great Shield, both described as legendary heirlooms uniquely held by Havel. And while many other warriors would join Havel's Covenant of Knights, it's only the armour he wears that states armour worn by Havel the Rock's warriors, while the weapon and shield suggest these are specific legendary heirlooms of Havel himself. Not long after these events, Seath's position would become concrete and he would begin to make extraordinary steps towards his goal. And in the midst of advancing his plea for immortality, he would devise crystal sorcery, and perhaps what Seath believed was a necessary stand-in for the scales of immortality that he lacked. Seath would run wild with crystal sorcery and create an entirely new biome of crystals where new life would flourish, which isn't surprising as he was empowered by the soul of sunlight, the original premise for life itself during the emergence of the Age of Fire. These crystals would birth a variety of flora and fauna unique to its geography, but more importantly would begin to draw the attention of others who sought to aid Seath's great advancements. Eventually, a cohort of men would emerge within the archives known as the Channelers, beings able to express Seath's sorcery as guards enforcing his monopoly of power in the wake of Havel's previous threats, but also enact more brazen extraterritorial missions of kidnapping and bringing more experiment fodder to Seath himself. It's likely these channelers, whom could now be found throughout Lordran and the world proper, would begin to spread the news of Seath's advancements far outside the reaches of Lordran itself, eventually leading to the construction of the Vinheim Dragon School, an enormously influential institution that would echo throughout the series that coveted Seath's sorcery and claimed his iconography as their own institutional symbol. More on them soon enough. But to return to the shimmer of doubts induced by Havel's rebellion, it wouldn't be long before Gwyn's fears would start to come to fruition, as soon enough early signs of the fire's fading would begin to rear its head. While we don't know for certain what these early signs were, we do know Gwyn would become incredibly fearful of what was to come and would set in motion acts that would be canonized truly as the first sin. With fears of his era fading and subsequently a fear of the Pygmies' rise, Gwyn would begin to seriously consider a future where he would have to sacrifice his own living flesh to the First Flame in order to reinvigorate the Age of Fire, but also knew his sacrifice would be nothing without setting in motion a sequence of events that would continue forcing others of great souls to burn their own souls to the First Flame too, ensuring the Age of Fire's immortal reign. However, as the First Flame fades, so does the power of those who source their strength from it, and thus it would be redundant to force the lesser gods to sacrifice themselves during its waning. With this conundrum, he would look back towards the Ring City and remember that where the flames fade and the power of the gods wane, the power of humans rises, and thus if a sequence of sacrifices would be required, sacrifices of great souls commanded by great beings, it would by nature have to be humans that would have to kindle the First Flame, which in itself is a contradictory practice, as if humans knew that the Age of Fire was the antithesis to their own age, where they reign supreme, none would ever seek to act in such a way. There were no material assurances that even the indoctrinated populace of the Ring City would kindle the First Flame, knowing the truth too. So Gwyn, knowing his reputation currently sat well with the populace of the Ring City due to his perceived altruism, ushered himself towards the isolated land and offered them a gift, or so they believed. This gift was the Dark Sign. Likely initially posed as a mark of their lordship, the Pygmies accepted the brand. However, without realizing it, these early humans who would come to represent the great totality of the Dark Soul and the populace of humans hitherto would inadvertently accept an indelible mark upon their very Dark Soul, a mark that would contain the humanity within, a mark that contained its powers, forcing humanity into a weakened state and tying its brilliance to the Age of Fire. Humans were now given a reason to believe the Age of Fire was good for them, as its waning would now incur hollowing, a curse that ripped from them their very sentience. As a final betrayal, Gwyn would leave the Ring City to be watched over by his youngest daughter, Filianor, a mark of his influence and a symbol of the Age of Fire's theocracy that the now branded Pygmies could look towards for salvation and answers. As a final mechanism, Gwyn would bequeath upon Filianor a vagrant egg. The vagrant egg held a mysterious property that allowed those of the Ring City to live in a warped version of reality, one completely detached from the world relative to the waning First Flame, thus adding another check and balance in the case the Pygmy Lords, and thus the great totality of the Dark Soul, could ever rebel against its chains, and insurance that the knowledgeable humans, descendants of the Pygmies bound to the real world, could never venture into and release the true nature of Gwyn's dark sign brand, and the prospects of an age of man to the Pygmies in a desperate plea to galvanize the totality of the Dark Soul and inherit a new age totally. As all humans that have since come to occupy Lordran and the greater world were descendants of these Pygmy Lords, they too would be bound by this dark sign curse, inheriting the Hollowing Curse too, leaving a great group of humans, descendants of the Dark Soul, to act when Gwyn would have to sacrifice himself to the First Flame. The nature of what a vagrant egg is perhaps the most elusive thing in the Dark Souls trilogy. We can in fact find a vagrant hatchling very rarely in our playthrough, often associated with the warping of time and the merger of worlds. This concept of being beyond time naturally points towards the everlasting dragons, something we explore in Dark Souls 2 with the Ashen Mist Heart, and of course is alluded to in the narrator's explanation during the introductory cutscene, suggesting it's a remnant artifact of the Age of Ancients, not dissimilar to the primordial crystal Seath would find to bind his immortality later on. This idea of salvaging from the Age of Ancients is not entirely unlike Gwyn. As we know, he too would salvage a great everlasting dragon in the form of Medea as a further mechanism to contain the darkness, left in the Ring City as an almighty failsafe. But it wasn't just Medea, Seath, or perhaps even the vagrant eggs that Gwyn would carry over from the everlasting dragon's lineage. In fact, at some unspecified time, it's very likely he would also make the company of the primordial serpent Frampt. What Frampt is will forever remain a mystery. We're told he comes from a cohort of serpents that are primordial, suggesting lineage dated back to the beginning of the universe, or perhaps coinciding with the everlasting dragons during the Age of Ancients. This isn't necessarily contradictory, as we do know many beings aside from the everlasting dragons did inhabit this world, but remained vacuous during its ancient conditions. Perhaps these serpents were dormant during this period like the humanoid underdwellers, but what we do know is that the serpents, upon the emergence of the Age of Fire, while existing outside the framework of time, found allegiances within the dialectical struggles of the Age of Fire. Frampt's early relationship with Gwyn, or perhaps the mechanisms of the Anolonder bureaucracy, while unknown, may have been deeply entrenched. Serpent iconography in popular fiction does often harken back to the biblical tales of Adam in Abrahamic culture, and thus Frampt may have been a sort of counsel to Gwyn during the construction of his new order. Regardless, what we do know is that Gwyn would corroborate with this primordial serpent to build a propaganda campaign that would tie the theology of the Age of Fire and its mission to remain hegemonic eternally with the humans that occupied the world. This campaign was built on a narrative that humans are responsible for making a sacrifice at the kiln of the First Flame in order to rebuild a world where the First Flame waned, and the hollowing was indicative of human apathy, a self-induced curse of inaction. Gwyn, alongside Frampt, would architect a story leading the most powerful humans during the Age of Waning Flames to venture on a pilgrimage a step at a time until they harvested great enough strength to burn their very soul to the kiln in Gwyn's stead. This was the most holy and commendable action any human could follow and would earn them a martyr status amongst the pantheon of gods. They would be known as Lords of Cinder. However, as alluded to earlier, Frampt was not the only primordial serpent, as beside him was Karth, the Great Darkstalker, a serpent that sought to ally itself with the plight of humanity, acting as a vanguard for humans and a balance to the propaganda campaign soon to emerge as the first flame faded. These primordial serpents had their ear to the ground and seemed to be almost omniscient in their understanding of the true nature of the world, and thus Karth, upon knowing of Gwyn's coming actions, would seek to balance this by going directly to Gwyn's true antithesis, the dormant and waiting furtive pygmy situated currently below Ulasil. Karth would make company with the dormant Lord of Darkness and would whisper the tale of Gwyn's betrayal of his kin, a betrayal extremely personal to his very being, as the Pygmy Lords were trusted with a portion of his own dark soul and essence of his very own being. This would absolutely enrage the furtive pygmy, causing him to take the form of Manus, proclaiming his position in no small manner as the Father of the Abyss. Manus's rage would begin a turning point in Gwyn's peacetime, as it would represent the first domino in the tragedy he had predicted would be true. Manus's presence would begin to warp the geography of Ulasil, and the humans that now made residence in the once peaceful Ulasil would begin to warp into monstrosities in line with their father's own form. Their humanity, despite being gripped by the dark sign, would push violently against these shackles, and they would turn into proxies of darkness, ready to build a legion to force Gwyn to reckon with his betrayal. Completely blindsided by this rage, Ulasil, a once peaceful region, would have no chance to defend themselves against Manus's rising influence, and a turning point would be set once a holy maiden of Ulasil would be captured deep below the earth, and so word would quickly make its way to the capital of the Age of Fire, and Gwyn would be made privy of Manus's rise. Not seeking to undermine the legitimacy of the Age of Fire, Gwyn would convene with his famous quartet of knights, and Artorias, a champion familiar with the rogue elements of the Dark Soul, would be tasked with approaching Ulasil to understand the nature of this threat, and more importantly, snuff it out and rescue the maiden. Artorias would agree with his lord, and in doing so, Gwyn would offer a pendant to the great champion as a failsafe against the elements of the dark, and as Artorias set off for what would be his final mission, his comrade Goff would come to accompany him too, perhaps due to the fact that there were words of a dragon that descended from the everlasting dragons now terrorizing the region too. So Artorias, bringing along his great companion Sif, would set off and would be acquainted with Elizabeth, a sentient mushroom and caretaker of the agricultural territory. She would shepherd him towards the infected township and brief him on the nature of this growing terror. Undeterred and likely feeling as though he was well prepared, armed with a weapon that carried a bane against the dark, he marched on the township and reckoned with the mutated humans, a version of darkness he had never come to face off against before. He would make quick work of Manus's minions and use his pendant to blast away the bolts of darkness thrown his way by the now mutated mystics, until he would find himself deep in the abyss, a place of true darkness, a place that felt familiar to Artorias. As we know, this abyss may have been in fact the underground territory all beings once lay dormant for eons prior to the emergence of the first flame. Brushing this feeling off and becoming overwhelmed by pure sprites of darkness, Artorias would draw his attention towards his companion Sif. As the volume of darkness increased, he knew whatever lay further on would likely be a grave threat not only to himself, but also his companion. Seeing no way back, he would offer his shield to Sif and tuck her away in a secret cavern, promising his return once it was all over with. Leaving Sif, he would venture on until finally he would come to the end of the cavern, and from the darkness eyes would emerge, and following them was a monster of immense primordial power, the root of all of the darkness in this world, the true father of humanity, Manus. As fearless as Artorias was outmatched, he fought this great beast, and while his efforts sung true to his own great strength, even reaching a temporary stalemate with the great progenitor of humanity, without his shield he would be left incredibly vulnerable, and in this moment Manus would inflict an irony upon the great god Artorias that would echo the hallowed state forced upon his own children. With his arms broken, Artorias would fall, and Manus would fade back. Awakening sometime after, Artorias would be left confused, battered, and with a deep-set amnesia. Remembering only his mission of fending off the elements of the dark, he would pick his now broken and infected blade with his left arm and return to the outside world, seeking only the destruction of the closest elements of dark he could find, eventually making his way to the entrance of the township, inadvertently as a defense mechanism and proxy of Manus's own influence. However, all was not lost for Gwyn, as lucky for him, the future actions of propaganda and steering humanity to act on behalf of the Age of Fire would lead to a convoluted time warp of a great chosen human champion that would return back in time to the world of Ulasil much long after the events of its demise to finally challenge the great Manus, likely carrying the power of the great three Lord Souls ready to link the First Flame himself. A detour would be made to this past time to challenge Manus, and finally bring him to his knees with the combined power of Izalith, Nito, and Gwyn's complete soul, shattering the remainder of his unbound dark soul across the world, and ending the terror of Ulasil for good. But the events of Ulasil would only come to represent the first rebellion of darkness, as Karth was not done meddling with Gwyn's plans. Some time would pass after the events of Ulasil's destruction, and during a period of relative peace, Karth would remain in the darkness, plotting his next act of rebellion. Karth rightfully saw the Ring City as far beyond saving at this point, and while it held a great aspect of darkness that could be turned against Gwyn, he sought a path of less resistance altogether, setting his sights on New Londo. As previously mentioned, New Londo was governed by 4 great pygmy lords that aided Gwyn's efforts against the everlasting dragons during the Great War of Ancients. These 4 lords were venerated with far more than just political autonomy and titles of lordship, as they were rewarded not dissimilar to Seath himself with a great portion of Gwyn's own Lord Soul. This meant they were a perfect synthesis of both the Age of Fire and the darkness of humanity. Karth rightfully looked towards the 4 lords as carrying a unique potential in leading a rebellion against Gwyn, but knew this time the rebellion will have to act in secrecy while they built the necessary strength to undo the Age of Fire from the inside out. And thus Karth's next stop would be New Londo, and soon enough he would be made well acquainted with the 4 residing rulers. Carrying the same message he had for the furtive pygmy, the 4 kings would lend an ear, but reserve their actions as they knew well to rebel against Gwyn and Anor Londo would spell self-annihilation. Karth expected the reaction and thus came bearing a gift of his own. This gift would be later understood as the power of Life Drain. Life Drain shows up various times throughout the series, but each time it does, whether related to the Darkwraiths later down the line or even Londor in Dark Souls 3, we know this was a power shared exclusively to humans by Karth himself. Life Drain was special as it offered a means to reconcile the power of the 4 kings against the Age of Fire, as it was a means in which driven humans could sap the humanity of other humans, essentially galvanizing the Dark Soul into beings already motivated by the goal of undoing the Age of Fire, rather than relying on the entirety of humanity to be convinced to rebel against the gods they were brainwashed to accept as their divine rulers. It didn't require secretly convincing humans to drop their lives to join their struggle. Rather, it could forcefully subdue humans into shedding their dark soul, and allowed for those who sought to weaponize it against Gwyn a valid means to do so. In this moment, the four kings, having harnessed the power of Life Drain, would lead a secret meeting amongst themselves and their most trusted knights, and after some deliberation they would agree to create a secret covenant of warriors with the sole goal of enacting vengeance against the Age of Fire for their transgressions against humanity. Thus would be born the first Darkwraith Covenant. Singing true to their abyssal heritage, they would don armours of darkness and send out missionaries across the land to preach the gospel of darkness or force opposers into submission. During this period, it's unlikely Gwyn would catch wind of this brewing rebellion, a rebellion that sought to galvanise more of the Dark Soul than was initially reckoned with during the events of Ulasil. The four kings grew in strength and their cadre grew too. However, if you remember much early on in the video, Anor Londo wasn't without its pre-existing concerns for such actions, and it would be Gwyndolin who would be tasked with ensuring order and policing for all internal affairs. Naturally, Gwyndolin's Darkmoon blades, specifically the red-robed mages that carried the Darkmoon sigil, would look over New Londo in secrecy, only to catch glimpses of this secret plot. Soon, a report would be made back to Gwyn in Anor Londo, detailing the emergence of this Darkwraith Covenant and the familiar power and influence once seen in Ulasil. New Londo was built geographically in a place that shouldered an enormous body of water. Whether this was a secret check and balance created by Gwyn knowing the nature of the pygmy rulers, or a pleasant coincidence, it offered Gwyn an opportunity to preemptively destroy the rising antagonisms growing in New Londo, but acted as a huge turning point to how far Gwyn was willing to go to combat the natural turning of ages, as this act, if pursued, would spell the death of hundreds of thousands of humans and even bury a portion of his own soul tied to the Four Lords deep below water. As you'd expect, the choice was made to flood New Londo, and as quick as the rebellion began, it would be over much quicker. The seal of New Londo would be lifted, and in doing so, a flood of biblical proportions would envelop the city, snuffing out the Four Kings and the Darkwraith Covenant. However, as we know, some Darkwraiths, likely those that ventured into the greater world, would remain, and despite the knowledge of their home being buried, it would only add fuel to their goal of undermining the Age of Fire, and thus they would continue to work in the shadows, seeking the destruction of the Age of Fire. These Darkwraiths would persist through the timeline, and have a very special place in the third installment as the basis for Londor, a revision of New Londo. All this being said, Gwyn had set himself down a path he could not return from, and all reservations on the extent to which he would protect the Age of Fire were now completely out of the window. And so, with Gwyn's spiral into a course he set out for himself in desperation, the fires of the First Flame began to fade. The first signs of this would be the hollowing. Humans of the Age of Fire would indiscriminately begin to succumb to the hollowing curse. Gwyn, fearing his own sacrifice loomed ever closer, first began to round up the hollowed population and incarcerated them in towering bastions, far away from the eyeshot of the general population, so as to maintain Anor Londo's perceived control. Hollowing and the waning flames would by nature also begin to start affecting Gwyn's own comrades. Following in Gwyn's course, Nito alongside Gwyn would create bonfires, ritual checkpoints linked directly to the First Flame that allowed humans to preserve as long as they could by offering souls and their own humanity to prolong the age. This act would be known as kindling, and offered both the temporary persistence of the First Flame, but also a means for humans to maintain their humanity by inadvertently bringing souls to the First Flame too, something credited in Gwyn's propaganda as once again a good thing for humans to do, with the ultimate goal these bonfires would lead humanity to the kiln at the end of Gwyn's own sacrifice in perpetuating the cycle. Izalith, however, perhaps the most in tune with the First Flame, would seek a different means in aiding in the preservation of the Age of Fire. She would seek to recreate the First Flame with her pre-existing control over fire. Whether through the blessings of Gwyn or a rogue attempt at preserving the fire holy to her queendom, she would, by the force of her own Lord Soul, create a bastardized version of the First Flame known as the Chaos, and malform herself, the residents of Greater Izalith, and even her daughters, into rabid mutations echoing the twisted reality of her own new form as the Bed of Chaos. The irony of Izalith's actions would be the creation of a flame that inherently opposed the First Flame. It was not only seen as a blasphemous act against divinity itself, but also the creation of a race in antithesis to the pre-existing order of Anor Londo Gwyn had sought to preserve. These moments would put Izalith in adversity with Gwyn, and Gwyn would look upon the demon race and Izalith herself as further proof of his waning hegemony. Already primed to act with enormous ferocity against any perceived weakness, Gwyn would finally launch an open and public offensive against this rival force, and for the first time since perhaps the Age of Ancients, gather the military of Anor Londo to face this threat head-on. A majority of this battle was fought by the infamous Silver Knights. As they marched on Izalith to snuff out the Chaos Flame, they would singe their armour and find themselves adorning black charred armaments, eventually coming to be known as the Black Knights, the specialised killers of all demon kind. The scale of the war against the demons is recounted throughout the events of all games as a battle that was immensely prolonged and cost the lives of thousands of Silver Knights. It's often also referred to as the primary reason so little of the Silver Knight Guard still remain alive in Anor Londo. And despite this prolonged effort, the war would only come to an end when Gwyn would subdue Izalith only enough to push them back to a corner of their original territory, burying the kingdom deep below earth so that Great Izalith would be no more, and in its stead, Lost Izalith would remain. Once Izalith was left a wasteland, the Black Knights would return to the kingdom of the gods, with the legacy of their trials commemorated forever on the armour that they would continue to adorn to this very day. In victory, Gwyn would, just as he had with parts of the everlasting dragons, take captive a variety of demons to make up for the loss of his men in Anor Londo. These captive demons would take on a variety of tasks, from guards to foot soldiers. However, Izalith was not the only other god that started to become troublesome, as Seath's experiments would begin to cause issues too, notably the creation of a being known as Crossbreed Priscilla. Priscilla's heritage was likely the unfortunate creation of an experiment between Seath and an unknown woman or goddess, with theories suggesting Guinevere herself. This abominable union was likely only possible as Seath carried a soul of Gwyn himself, and thus by proxy, if Guinevere or a royal princess was the mother to Priscilla, it would be in many ways incestuous in nature, birthing defects and unforeseeable traits. Gwyn naturally looked upon Priscilla as a taboo subject that should be kept far away from the eyes of the Land of Gods, and thus, much as he did with the undead, would seal her away in one of his penal institutions, likely the same undead prison our protagonist would eventually find themselves in, as we can find her doll in one of these cells, suggesting even during her early childhood she was neglected and left to dirt. However, despite her kind nature and pacifistic tendencies, Priscilla would grow to inherit a power only seen in Nito, a means to channel the occult and kill gods themselves. This power would be canonized as Life Hunt, a unique form of occult strength only ever attributed to Priscilla in the entire trilogy. Anor Londo's bureaucracy likely knew that growing Priscilla held these properties, and seeking to avert another catastrophe on par with the events of Izalith's mutation, Gwyn would commission a person known as Artorias to create a world within worlds in the form of a painting that would be referred to as the Painted World of Artorias. After its construction, Gwyn would urge Priscilla to seek refuge within this painting for eternity. Priscilla, uncaring for conflict, would leave for the Painted World, and this Painted World would go on to become something of Gwyn's dumping ground, a place where he would throw away things that he saw as threatening towards the land of gods. And finally, he would place a new cohort of warriors known as the Painting Guardians to ensure nothing would ever leave the painting. But despite all of this, the flames continued to fade in the background, and Gwyn, seeing no other means to preserve his dying kingdom, looked towards the first flame and knew it was time he sacrificed his own flesh to preserve this age. With a propaganda campaign successfully entrenched, and Frampt assuring to carry Gwyn's mission, with the darkness subdued and Anor Londo protected from the demon race, Gwyn would meet with his son, the Nameless King, for a final time in his bedchamber, ready to pass down his crown to his eldest child. The Nameless King would take the crown and promise to his father to preserve his legacy. After a heartfelt moment with his firstborn, Gwyn would finally make the long walk towards the first flame. It's hard not to imagine Gwyn feeling the gravity of the moments before sacrificing his flesh to the first flame, whether reservations, regret of his former actions, or a solemn one-sidedness plagued his mind. He would throw himself to the fire, and from his body burned a great new flame, and the age of fire would reign supreme once more. Gwyn's sacrifice would send ripples through both Anor Londo and the greater world, and he would be heralded as the great god of gods that martyred himself to preserve the dignity of both humans and gods alike. In these moments, the Nameless King was crowned as the new god of gods and prime overseer of Anor Londo, and the gods would bow to him as they once did for Gwyn. Unlike the rule of Gwyn, the Nameless King's history, while likely vast, is intentionally missing from the canon of the game, as we learn the moment in history that would shroud any stories of the Nameless King's tenure would be his action to eventually abandon the throne of Anor Londo to ally himself with the dragons he once butchered during the Age of Ancients, and serve to protect and fight alongside them far beyond the reaches of Anor Londo and the land of the Lords. We don't know why the Nameless King would act in such a manner, but it likely had to do with a great deal of rumination on his purpose in this world. He likely saw his father's sacrifice as redundant and a perversion of nature's inevitable course. In doing so, he would look towards the dragons as beings that fell out of this cycle his father had imposed, and seeking to no longer be a pawn in a fate he had no affinity towards, he would seek to live amongst them outside the confines of time itself. The Nameless King's recension of the throne was no spectacular moment in history. Context from Dark Souls 3 suggests, in his final moment as Anor Londo's monarch, he would walk to his father's altar to seek counsel from him, eventually lightly putting down his crown and a special ring that signified his rule as he walked away from Anor Londo for good. However, not all of Anor Londo's bureaucracy took well to the Nameless King's choice to rescind the throne. In fact, it would be Gwyndolin, the leader of Gwyn's great police force and sibling to the Nameless King, that would be absolutely abhorred by the actions, seeing it as blasphemy and betrayal of everything their father fought for. Gwyndolin would take control of Anor Londo from the shadows and decree all imagery of the Nameless King, including his name, would be etched out of history for good. Understanding the sacrifices made by Gwyn in life and in death, he did not seek to see his actions be undone by his own blood, and sought to rectify and salvage as much of Anor Londo as he possibly could. This violent etching out of history would be anything but covert, and the absence of a true ruler would begin to cause political strife within Anor Londo itself. Gwyndolin did everything he could to retain Anor Londo, but the damage was done, and many gods of true lineage to Gwyn would begin to leave. The most important figure to step away would be Princess Guinevere, the religious icon for the theocracy that bound Anor Londo. Gwyndolin understood Guinevere's absence would reduce Anor Londo's legitimacy in this world significantly, and thus in her stead he would create an illusion of Guinevere and crown this illusion as the overseer of Anor Londo in lieu of the Nameless King. Despite this, many other gods would leave, effectively leaving Gwyndolin alone in charge of preserving the Age of Fire's legitimacy and Anor Londo as a beacon of its hegemony. Some of the gods of Gwyn's original bureaucracy would seek to rule different parts of the world. Allfather Lloyd initially represented law and social classes within Anor Londo. His time within Anor Londo during Gwyn's reign was credited with the creation of the Way of the White, specialised in conserving the influence of the gods, especially in the face of a dwindling Age of Fire. However, after the Great Exodus, Allfather Lloyd would restructure the Way of the White in a separate region known as Thoroland. Thoroland would hence become the cultural and political centre of the Age of Fire's theocracy, devolving much of Anor Londo's influence, becoming something akin to the modern-day Vatican. The nobility of Thoroland would go on to adopt positions of religious authority and become mediums to exert Allfather Lloyd's teachings. This devolution and being away from the rigid, watchful eye of an all-ruling monarch would fundamentally change the Way of the White, as despite their initial conservatism, there would become more than just a clerical set of followers bound to Guinevere. Instead, under Lloyd's political autonomy, they would take on militaristic tendencies and lay the foundation for a paladin class of worshippers, something that may have originally never have been the case, as Anor Londo strictly held its military confined to the likes of Gwyndolин's police force, the Silver Knights, and of course Gwyn's famous Quartet of Knights. However, while the likes of Allfather Lloyd still represented themselves as faithful to the old religion of Anor Londo and subtly changed the tenets of the old rigid theology to fit their own goals, other gods sought to distance themselves entirely. These untethered gods would find a home in a part of the world known as Carim. While Carim is not explicitly spoken of as an anti-theistic country, we learn from Oswald and Lautrec that Carim would house a variety of different religious beliefs, often giving home to those who worship the gods not bound to the mythology of Gwyn and the Age of Fire. Goddess Fina is spoken of in small amounts, but it's indicated she, like Lloyd, was also an integral member of Gwyn's bureaucracy. But after the Great Exodus, she would flee and renounce her affection to Gwyn's project and continue to work independently elsewhere. This elsewhere was likely referring to Carim itself. Fina was often referred to as favourous, embracing and protective, which may allude to what her original role was as a god in Anor Londo during Gwyn's reign. And while Anor Londo would laud Fina as being fickle, likely referring to her refusal to conform, she would become the mark of worship for many humans in Carim as a goddess that loved lesser beings, notably humans, finding worshippers that both would begin to detest the class antagonisms of Anor Londo, but also deeply faithful to a god that once walked amongst them. This, of course, most relevant to a character we can ourselves meet, known as Lautrec, and an explanation as to why Lautrec sought to undermine the Age of Fire entirely. However, Fina is not the only god who followed this path, and perhaps the most devastating of losses to Gwyndolin was none other than the goddess Velka. According to the Book of the Guilty, we're told Velka, much like All-Father Lloyd, was a distinguished member of Gwyn's old bureaucracy. While Lloyd was responsible for the preservation of Anor Londo's theocracy, the spell comic Justice tells us Velka was responsible in defining sin and according punishment. In this sense, Velka represented Anor Londo's judiciary. Naturally, her role as the crown member of the judiciary would bring her into close proximity to Gwyndolin and the Blades of the Darkmoon, and it may be Velka's influence that created many of the Darkmoon Covenant spells, which explains their iconic purple hue. The Blades of the Darkmoon were the executive wing of Anor Londo, acting as the institution's monopoly of power. In a similar sense, while Velka represented the courts and legislature, Gwyndolin represented the police and armed forces. It's therefore not surprising to see the parallels between Velka and the Darkmoon Covenant, as both were symbiotic during their heyday in Anor Londo. Velka in so many ways was integral to Gwyndolин's own purpose in Anor Londo, and it wouldn't be a stretch to assume the relationship between both deities was deeply entrenched. Velka's followers no doubt crossed paths with Gwyndolин's followers too. However, the exodus of gods, unfortunately for Gwyndolin, included Velka. The reason Velka would abandon her post is hard to say for certain, but it's very likely Velka saw Anor Londo and Gwyn's great project as inherently flawed and began to build immense sympathy for beings that found themselves victimized by its preservation. We know this to be true as, unlike other gods that fled for different countries, Velka would flee to the world of Ariamis and would join Priscilla in offering comfort and guidance to those left to die in isolation in the Painted World. Velka's presence in the Painted World would be profound, and many of her followers would establish a culture of their own within the Painted World, working alongside Priscilla to preserve the peace. Velka during her premiership would garner a huge collection of followers. These followers would reside in two forms. Some would remain in the waking world, continuing her efforts alongside Gwyndolin, while others would follow her to the Painted World of Ariamis, where the domain would be heavily influenced by her presence. While it's unclear what Velka did in the Painted World, it can be assumed that she, feeling as though Gwyn deserved punishment due to his sinful actions, began to ally herself with the very place that hosted the power to truly bring down the very gods. In Ariamis, a crucial change would begin to happen to Velka's image. She went from one that solely cast judgment to punish, to one that welcomed the judged for absolution, a concept represented by her image in later installments as a mother reaching out below. Amongst these gods, many others would of course flee too, with theories suggesting Guinevere would flee to marry the flame god Flann in a distant land reminisced in Dark Souls 2, and so on. This left Gwyndolin effectively alone to rule over Anor Londo all by himself. Thankfully, some gods did remain loyal. We know even Ornstein stuck around despite the pain of having lost his great hero, the Nameless King, resorting to secretly continuing his worship of the Nameless King in a covenant known as the Heir of the Sun, where the Nameless King continued to answer their prayers. Beside Ornstein was of course Smaug too, the once residing executioner of the land who would grow in size due to how many executions he had to carry out. Smaug no doubt stuck around not for his loyalty to the kingdom, but the prospect of continuing the executions he would become incredibly fond of. Ornstein and Smaug would be elevated to a position of authority and become the great guards of Anor Londo's throne, while Gwyndolin would marionette the illusion of Guinevere with the goal of keeping Gwyn's most important mission alive, the preservation of the Age of Fire through the rite of kindling the first flame. Gwyndolin would thus turn Anor Londo from the great cultural capital of the Land of the Lords to an institution with the singular goal of maintaining Gwyn's legacy of sacrifice alive, and in doing so would commission the creation of Sen's fortress, a gauntlet built by giant slaves that would act as a proving ground for human seekers of the First Flame and shortlist candidates for an entrance to Anor Londo and eventually the Lord Vessel, a means to harness and transfer the power of Gwyn, Nito and Isolith's soul to eventually contest the kiln of the First Flame. There are indications that Gwyndolin would maintain good ties to the neighbouring Pale Drake Seath, and Seath would reciprocate allegiance by sending serpent warriors born from his morbid experiments to add a further layer of difficulty to a gauntlet riddled with traps. Seath may have seen this transaction as beneficial directly to himself, as it would have offered another means to capture more experiment fodder. It's also likely Seath would even aid in the creation of the Gauntlet's final challenge, this of course being the creation of the Iron Golem. This is likely as we do know the object that powered this automaton was none other than a soul linked to the bones of an everlasting dragon, a machination unseen in the trilogy and likely paying homage to Seath's understanding of the everlasting dragons and Gwyndolin's link to his father Gwyn. With the fortress built and bell towers situated across Lordran to indicate a worthy contender has arisen, Gwyndolin would convene with Gwyn's old companion Framt and ensure all things were in order to shepherd humanity towards the legacy set out by Gwyn himself. Firekeepers would be placed across Lordran to echo this sentiment and offer solace and reassurance to human champions when the coming days of the Waning Flame would rear its head once more. Gwyndolin would thus go back into the shadows and watch over Anor Londo, acting as the bearer of Gwyn's legacy and a ruler that would not allow the Age of Fire to dwindle. Soon enough, Gwyndolin would reorganise the Darkmoon Blades and continue policing the Age of Fire from the shadows, setting sights on the fragmented elements of the Dark that continued to plot against the Age of Fire, something that would naturally put him in constant contention with the Darkwraiths. As for the other Lord Soul bearers during this period, we learn the loss of guidance from Gwyn, and Anor Londo being left a shadow of its former self would allow them some degree of peace and autonomy. Isolith, now known as the Bed of Chaos, would begin to rebuild her home within Lost Isolith, and the demon race born from her misdeeds would begin to show greater signs of sentience, and a unique culture would emerge unbound to one that was solely represented by torment. However, this isn't to say torment was not still an integral part of Lost Isolith's identity, as her children, the Great Witch Daughters, would continue to live their lives in drastic conditions, some as mutated beasts such as Quelaag and the Fair Lady, and others such as Quelana, who avoided the brunt of her mother's mutation, would begin to form a oneness with the Chaos Flame inherent to her mother's form, not seeing her mother as a sinner all believed her to be, rather still a beacon of great power and cultural relevance and something worth admiring and harnessing. Quelana would spend much of her time in solitude, unable to live amongst her sisters within Lost Isolith, likely feeling a great degree of survivor's guilt towards the effects her mother's mutation would have over her siblings. However, in her solitude she would harvest a portion of the Chaos Flame and go on to create the art of pyromancy, a power not dissimilar to fire sorcery that sourced its strength not from the First Flame, rather directly from the Bed of Chaos and the Chaos Flame once built to stand in its place. This art would begin to show signs of immense influence. The channeling of demonic strength would even draw the attention of apprentices to Quelana, notably Solomon, a man from a swampy region of the world. Quelana would see great potential in Solomon and offer him a portion of the Chaos Flame and teach him what she could about pyromancy directly. Solomon would develop a mastery of the art, and it would be Solomon who would eventually return home to disseminate Quelana's teachings, popularizing the art of pyromancy in the Great Swamp, and by proxy, the wider world. Stories of Quelana would echo amongst all those that would behold pyromancy, and its power and murmurs of Solomon's stories would conjure up the myth of a pilgrimage all great pyromancers must take, one that had them venture into the land of the lords and seek acquaintance with this legendary witch. But what of Nito? Well, we learn Nito continued to practice the ritual of offering proper death as he always had during the First Age of Fire. His Gravelord servants maintained their duties and he continued to source great power towards the bonfires of the world in accordance to Gwyn's wishes. However, Nito would at some point become relatively laissez-faire, and some beings would begin to make residence within the catacombs itself, notably a distressed man known as Pinwheel. While the witch daughter Quelana found a means of harnessing the power of Izalith through her existing affinity to her mother, we learn Pinwheel would find a very different way of utilising the power of a lord. There aren't a lot of details around Pinwheel himself, but from the description of his masks, specifically the Mask of the Father, we're told of a story related to a man who had once lost his entire family and would seek nothing more than their resurrection to reconcile his grief. This grief would eventually lead him to the catacombs and likely the burial grounds of his family. Setting up station near their tombs, Pinwheel would deliberate time and time again on how to bring his family back to life, eventually concluding that this would require the power of the reigning lord of the tombs himself. Understanding Nito was unlikely to rescind proper death, he would scheme in the shadows and eventually through means unknown steal an aspect of power directly related to Nito himself. This would be a power referred to us as the Rite of Kindling. Kindling itself, in practical terms, is the device used to empower bonfires, and thus has an inherent link to the First Flame. We know the Lord Soul-bearing gods all shared special affinities to the First Flame, and as the First Flame was indeed the progenitor of sentience itself, it likely held a power to recreate life again, much as it had during the dawn of time. However, Pinwheel was no god, nor chosen by the First Flame during the Age of Ancients, and thus his use of this tool would recreate his family in an abhorrent manner, melding their bodies into his own and forcing him to take a new form entirely, the form we recognise as Pinwheel in the game proper. This would in turn reduce Nito's presence in the world, and whether out of apathy or inconvenience, he would not react violently, and just allow Pinwheel to annex a portion of the catacombs. During the following events, with Gwendolyn controlling Anolondo and a variety of new regions emerging across the world, eons would go by as the world diversified immensely. Stories of Gwyn's sacrifice would crawl further into the territory of mythology, and the land of the lords would begin to fall into obscurity too, left to the imagination of generations that would emerge across the world. Some countries more than others would maintain deep allegiances to the tale of Gwyn and the land of the lords, such as the Astorians, a night culture that were given childhood tales of the undead prophecy and the reality that one day a chosen champion would have to emerge to venture into the land of the lords. Other countries would continue to make leaps in their own technological advancements, finding deep independence in their own beliefs, such as that of Vinheim, seeing the land of the lords not as a tale of prophecy, but the birthplace of sorcery. But what is for certain is that no matter what part of the world developed and continued on, one thing was for certain: there will come a time where the First Flame will fade again, and the humans that now populate the world will have to reckon with the hollowing and converge towards the land of the lords to play their part in the fire-linking cycle forced upon them by a god who selfishly clung to an era he would only experience a fraction of. This is the part you're all probably most familiar with, as this is when our own protagonist begins their own journey. Eons after the events spoken of earlier, we enter this world as an almost entirely hollowed human, left for dead in one of Gwyn's old asylums built to house undead humans. We are in this moment gripped by the crushing reality of the Dark Sign curse, and are desperate to seek remedial treatment for this curse, not knowing what this may entail. Desperate and left to rot in one of these cells, we are introduced to Oscar of Astora. As mentioned earlier, Astora, more than most other regions, held closest the stories of Gwyn's propaganda, and thus Oscar, on a mission to the land of the Lords, believing the remedy to the curse lay in Lordran, would end up freeing us, and eventually speak of a prophecy once told to him during his childhood, one that speaks of reaching the land of the Lords and ringing the bells of awakening. As our protagonist walks through the asylum, one thing is clear: the extent to which Hollowing has engulfed the world is far beyond anything it had ever seen before. The cells of this asylum are filled, and hollowed humans litter the corridor. We are in the midst of the end of the Age of Fire as we know it. As we follow Oscar of Astora's prophecy, we eventually come up against the Asylum Demon, a captive member of the demon race from the old siege against Izalith that Gwyn himself had conducted during Izalith's transformation into the Bed of Chaos. This demon is adorned with a weapon that is described as innately linked to the bark of the stone arch trees that once littered the world during the Age of Ancients, yet another heirloom kept on hand by Gwyn after salvaging what he could from the war itself. Defeating the Asylum Demon gives us access to a ledge which leads to a sequence where a crow leads us away to Lordran, the forgotten land of the Lords and the convergence point destined for all humans. The first person we can meet here is an unnamed man. This is the Crestfallen Warrior, who appears to regurgitate a similar prophecy told to us by Oscar. Interestingly, his armour or dialogue don't give us specific cues as to where he originates, but in combat he fares incredibly well, likely alluding to coming from a part of the world with a well-entrenched warrior class. Despite his nihilistic tone, the Crestfallen Warrior acts as great narrative relief throughout the entire adventure, narrating the menial events that happen around the Firelink Shrine. His dialogue actually paints the picture of the Firelink Shrine taking on a far more communal and lively aura than the gameplay suggests. The Crestfallen Warrior gossips about other characters who join the circle, telling us of Grigg's hilarious obsession over Big Hat Logan, and even Laurentius's infectious optimism. His dialogue opens up our imagination that paints the area as a true warm respite where adventurers from cultures far and wide find commonality, a place to eat, rest, and of course, refill our Estus. The Crestfallen Warrior helps us see Lordran as a place that is beginning to bloom with activity, truly envisaging the land as the convergence point for the cultures that have thus matured since the events of Gwyn's premiership during the First Age of Fire. With this being said, upon taking the path of least resistance, we make our way through to the Undead Burg, a dilapidated fortress that now houses a plethora of undead soldiers, aimlessly defending the fort. This dilapidation begins to make sense as the Burg would become overrun by contentious forces. Even the demons of Izalith have found their way out of their home to reap the advantages of the Age of Fire waning, with both the Taurus demons having made their home in the fort explaining much of the destroyed walls, and even Capra demons, far more intelligent beasts from Izalith, now controlling hounds to annex parts of this territory. Of course, before all of this, we are made acquainted with the Hellkite Drake, a descendant of the everlasting dragons that has found the bravery to begin terrorizing parts of Lordran in its fading form. But not everything is immediately a threat to our player, as within the walls of the Burg we can find an undead merchant. The undead merchant sells a basic set of wares, mostly through spouts of salvaging the nearby soldiers close to his residence. When provoked, he utilizes an Uchigatana, giving us insight as to where he came from before setting up in Lordran. The Uchigatana tells us it is a katana forged in an eastern land, relating the undead merchant to a cohort of other Easterners that we'll become acquainted with during our time in Lordran. The Easterners, as we learn, are usually quite a solitude nation of warriors that would become incredibly infamous for breeding some of the most talented swordsmen in the entire world. As we learn from the likes of Shiva, their presence outside of the Eastern lands are often driven by specific pursuits or goals. The Uchigatana would mirror the skill set that would come to represent the Easterners, but it's clear this undead merchant is far past his prime. His existence gives us contextual clues that Lordran has not recently become a convergence point for undead humans, rather the hollowing has been going on for many years, enough so that a once dutiful warrior from the Eastern lands adorned with their blades of expertise would be able to grow old and distasteful towards the prophecy that brought them here in the first place. Old enough that he is now unable to even lift the Uchigatana with any decent effect or proficiency. Not far along the Undead Berg, and after reckoning with the Taurus demon, we are acquainted with a man looking into the distance near a ledge that inevitably leads to the Undead Parish. This man is, of course, Solaire. Solaire is much like Oscar from Astora, and thus was born with both the prophecy of Gwyn's great sacrifice and the reverence of the Age of Fire at the height of his upbringing. Unlike Oscar, however, Solaire seemed to excel quite greatly as a warrior, his armour suggesting that amongst the hierarchy of knights within Astora, Solaire may have risen to a place of great distinction, enough so he would be referred to directly as a Knight of Sunlight. For a region so heavily involved with the mythology of Gwyn, it's very likely this title that shares homage to Gwyn's own title as the Lord of Sunlight would require great feats, something reinforced by his armour description suggesting he gained incredible prowess through rigorous training. Further clues as to how Solaire would win such distinction are his relation to the heir of the Sun Covenant. If you remember from much early on in the video, this is the very same covenant that heralded the great Nameless King, the same covenant deeply worshipped by Ornstein himself. We do, however, know that the imagery of the Nameless King and all mentions of his mythology alongside Gwyn's were etched forcefully out of history by Gwyndolin. It's extremely unlikely Astora, a region that saw itself as a mirror of Anor Londo, would ever come to know of the Nameless King himself, which would suggest Solaire, while associated with the heir of the Sun Covenant, never truly understood that he was not worshipping Gwyn's sunlight, rather worshipping the current living deity, the Nameless King, explaining how Solaire has access to lightning spear miracles exclusive only to us as the player, and Solaire too. This concept of Solaire being a deeply misguided man who chased only the favour of the Age of Fire and the Sun would inevitably rear its ugly head throughout his timeline in the game, as despite carrying himself as the lovable optimist who's always willing to help the player, he eventually is blinded by his pursuit of the sun as he makes his way to Lost Izalith and gets captured by a sunlight maggot. However, what's interesting in relation to Solaire and the history of Dark Souls 1 is that despite Gwyndolin seeking to etch the Nameless King out of history, even the broken shrines once dedicated to him are still altars of prayer for those that seek the favour of the sun, and early evidence even all the way back in Dark Souls 1 that the Nameless King lives on. Venturing down from this point will eventually lead us to a city below the Undead Berg. It's clear this city has been absolutely ravaged by something related to the loose hounds found throughout the area, and as alluded to earlier, this may be totally due to the presence of the Capra Demon, a monster from Izalith re-emerging from the ground to capitalise on Lordran's disarray amidst the waning First Flame. Within this area, we can free a man that goes by the name of Griggs of Vinheim, and as you'd expect, Griggs is a sorcerer from the prestigious Dragon School in Vinheim. Griggs was not unlike many other budding scholars born in this area. We learn he rose through the ordinary path of sorcery at a very young age and did so by admiring a man named Logan, who researched at the institution while Griggs was still building his own influence and knowledge. Griggs, unlike say Oscar or even the Crestfallen Warrior, is in Lordran in search of Big Hat Logan. Logan's contributions to the Dragon Academy were monumental, and he would come to represent the cutting edge of the Academy's advancements in sorcery. So it would come as no surprise that when Logan would one day announce his leave from the Academy, seeking the home of sorcery itself in the Land of the Lords, the institution and the general leaders would not take fondly to his abrupt exit, but naturally Logan, having claimed such an executive rank within the Academy, meant he would leave unobstructed. However, the Dragon School was much more mature by this point. They were no longer just an academy in Vinheim. They had become the prime governing body of Vinheim, and thus, as we learn from the Black Sorcerer's robes, the academy had built something of a network of spies with proficiency in stealth-based spells. The Hush spell suggests this was done to exert secret influence across the nation of Vinheim proper. At the height of this secret cabal were the elusive Black Sorcerers. Robed in black attire, the item description tells us of their secret operations and how they worked with sound-based spells. This is relevant as we learn Griggs was one of such a secret sorcerer. Griggs, having followed the teachings of Logan, showing great longing to learn from the man, and carrying the expertise to conduct himself quietly, would be tasked by the institution to follow Logan and feed back any findings to the academy, as they feared Logan was unlikely to return. Griggs would naturally take well to this task due to his already established longing to learn from the Great Scholar, and in due time would follow Logan all the way back to the land of the Lords. However, Lordran is, as we learn quite early on, no cakewalk, and he would find himself at a standstill in the lower Undead Burg only for us to rescue him. Griggs strikes us as quite bumbling and misled, but we learn from the crestfallen warrior he is willing to go to near self-destructive lengths to retain proximity to Big Hat Logan, and while he falls short attempting to follow Logan through Sen's fortress going hollow within its walls, we do know Griggs, if left alone after Logan's departure in the Firelink Shrine, can enrich himself in Logan's left behind work and even replicate iconic spells such as Soul Spear, an art Vinheim itself likely didn't understand and had lost proximity to after Logan's departure. In any case, as we contest the Capra demon and from its corpse are granted passage to the depths, we learn the Undead Burg, this periphery town that linked to the great city of Anor Londo, had built an underground network, perhaps once for storage or perhaps as a slum for less well-off peasantry to live in. The depths of course would also connect the infamous sewage network of Lordran, leading ultimately down to Blighttown, the garbage endpoint of Lordran. Upon exploring this area, however, we meet a man named Laurentius in a manner not dissimilar to Griggs, except Laurentius has been captured and tied down by a butcher, supposedly as livestock. Butchers appear to be in control of a great deal of this underground area, and much like the Capra demons, exert control over the area through hounds and rodents, all bending to their will and likely brought under control as they would feed and nourish the underdwellers. Upon release, Laurentius tells us of his origins in the Great Swamp. As mentioned earlier, the Great Swamp was the land that once found great influence through the dissemination of pyromancy from Salamon, Quelana's only apprentice. As we learn from the following installments, the Great Swamp would become a somewhat insular community after Salamon's return. Much of the world, still bound by the stories of Gwyn's prophecy, would look upon the Great Swamp in a manner not dissimilar to how Gwyn once looked upon Great Izalith after the emergence of the Chaos Flame. Despite this, pyromancy as an art would flourish in this part of the world. Many advancements would be made here that incorporated these swampish characteristics. We're told Salamon returned to the Great Swamp and took on apprentices of his own, notably a woman named Carmina. This would spin off into various generations descending from Salamon's teachings, and eventually a thriving culture would grow of pyromancers that held great influence in the area. And as you'd expect, Laurentius is one of these great descendants. Laurentius, while extremely courteous and eager to help the player, is here not on the pursuit of some undead prophecy, rather in pursuit of Quelana, seeking the mother of pyromancy and the woman who once brought pyromancy through Salamon to the greater world, for a chance to further his own pursuit of a greater understanding of pyromancy altogether. It's clear from Laurentius's own wares and abilities that he is nowhere near equipped to either challenge Lordran nor be granted an audience with Quelana like Salamon did many years ago, and thus his story eventually ends in Blighttown, not far from Quelana, clearly not having shown the prowess for her to be made visible to him and eventually going hollow altogether. However, before our own introduction to Blighttown, we can make our way further down the depths and meet another man named Donal from a faraway land known as Xena. The land of Xena is only ever spoken of through the Adventurer's armor set and the character creation menu. This place is described as a place that is both ancient but also renowned for merchants and carrying wisdom. It's thus unsurprising to find Donal acting as a vendor and even offering wisdom to the player relative to how much we spent on his wares. In the design work interviews, Miyazaki suggests Donal is something of a trickster, and upon further investigation, we do know the wares he can sell us relate entirely to the bosses we have already killed, suggesting Donal follows our player in secrecy and takes advantage of our own victories to sell back to us for more gold. In any case, Xena continues through the trilogy to be one of the more mysterious regions in the world, and we can see some evolution in Xena from Dark Souls 2, particularly in the story related to Magarold and the likelihood that Xena would later come to be known as Lanifir. Moving on, in due time we're matched against a malformed dragon with heritage directly linked to the everlasting dragons, and during this period we are also given an introduction to the ranging influence of Seath the Scaleless, as we can find his channelers plotted around the area, suggesting Seath's influence has grown heavily since the exodus of the former gods, and even the deepest depths of Lordran are now under his watchful eye. Soon enough, after claiming victory, we can make our way to Blighttown, the endpoint of Lordran's dumping ground. Blighttown is a labyrinth of destroyed infrastructure. It's clear whatever was intended for Blighttown during its construction, it has since been abandoned but continued to carry waste. It's also unsurprising this dumping ground blocks the entrance to Lost Izalith. The gods may have first conjured the idea to develop this region to both get rid of excess waste, but also act as a means to block Izalith after pushing the demon race far into obscurity. Nevertheless, there is one important figure who remains here, Quelana, the great witch daughter from the primordial age. A god in every right sits looking towards the entrance of Izalith, still enveloped in her survivor's guilt. If our previous affinity to pyromancy has reached a peak, we can, unlike Laurentius, speak with Quelana, where she shares exposition on the nature of pyromancy and agrees to take us on as her pupil, not unlike Salomon many eons ago. Unfortunately, we are given further reassurance Quelana is one of only a few of Izalith's great daughters that retains her usual form, as upon entering Izalith through a cocooned web, we have to reckon with Quelaag, a sibling to Quelana that has been deeply malformed by the events of Izalith's corruption. Taking on a spidery form, she has taken the role as a caretaker for yet another sister of Chaos, who now resides beyond her boss arena, surviving off remnants of humanity to continue acting as a caretaker for lesser residents of Izalith who have become pus-filled maggots given some degree of solace through her sacrifice. Upon defeating Quelaag, we can meet this sibling, but before we do, we have to first get the blessings of Aingi. Aingi, much like Laurentius, comes from the Great Swamp. Aingi gives us further exposition on the culture of the Great Swamp, suggesting no matter how heretical the world saw the Great Swamp, they still stuck by a certain degree of limits and laws. Aingi, perhaps on his own volition, would commission 2 special pyromancies during his life in the Great Swamp, these being Poison Mist and Toxic Mist. The description of Toxic Mist tells us of how Aingi would be seen as a heretic amongst heretics due to the creation of this pyromancy spell, proving again that even amongst the marginalised pyromancers of the Great Swamp, they still held some degree of conservatism in practicing this art. The irony, of course, is that pyromancy itself is born from the perversion of the First Flame, and Aingi's actions were in many ways more truthful to the story of pyromancy than anything practiced by those of the Great Swamp. It's thus not surprising that Aingi, upon exile, would find himself travelling to the Land of the Lords, seeking Izalith or perhaps the Great Swamp of Blighttown for himself, and eventually he would stumble upon the entrance to Lost Izalith and find himself spared by Quelaag, making acquaintance with the fair lady. While unable to speak to this sibling of chaos, he would find himself deeply moved by her sacrifice and her willingness to protect and preserve the lives of the maggot-infested populace of Upper Izalith, and would, likely due to his pre-existing affinity to poison, willfully accept the maggot infection for himself and pledge to preserve and take care of the fair lady. If we make peace with Aingi and his mission, we ourselves can become acquainted with this daughter of Izalith, and are offered a place in the Servant of Chaos Covenant, a group of specialised heroes seeking nothing more than the preservation of this selfless figure. The fair lady, we learn, has been consuming the poisonous blight of Izalith in an act to spare the inhabitants of disease. She continues to live, but in absolute agony, spared the ultimate pain of death through the offerings of humanity, as alluded to from Quelaag's own story. In Quelaag's absence, we can take the mantle of preserving her. However, we learn beside ourselves and Aingi, there was one other great champion that looked towards the plight of the fair lady and dedicated his own life in her preservation too. This, of course, being the Knight Kirk. Kirk used to be a Darkwraith, the same faction mentioned earlier that was birthed in New Londo, seeking the usurpation of the First Flame and the destruction of the Age of Fire. While we learn that many Darkwraiths after the destruction of New Londo would scatter and later even go on to develop Londor, some, specifically Kirk, would go on to find new meaning altogether, focusing his talents on a different cause of a similar premise, to help the victims of Gwyn's crusade, but instead of looking towards humans, he would identify with the pain of another specific victim of Gwyn's oppressive streak, the Fair Lady of Izalith. Kirk, between the context of Dark Souls 3 and 1, is labelled as one of the most successful Darkwraiths during his tenure as a warrior of the Four Kings, enough so that his escapades across Greater Londor would earn him infamy across the region. His highly specialised skill set would even have him adorning a particularly offensive version of the Darkwraith armour, and the extent to which he would use the power of Life Drain would extend his life for eons, making it all the way to the third installment of the series. However, in Dark Souls 1, Kirk would use Life Drain not to galvanise the Dark Soul against the Age of Fire specifically, but rather to siphon the life force of humanity from other humans and feed this directly back to the Fair Lady to preserve her life. During our own playthrough, we can meet Kirk in various locations, having invaded the player in the event that they have consumed humanity. He shows up throughout Izalith and even within the depths too, attempting to take our humanity for this cause. While there is a way of ending Kirk's aggression by contesting each invasion, eventually earning us his armour set within the Fair Lady's lair, the canon of his story has him withstand the events of the first game, eventually leading us to finding Kirk in the final installment, having acquired the rank of Longfinger within Rosaria's Covenant in that respective game. A mirror of the Fair Lady in many ways, but a story we'll hold off for that respective video. Nevertheless, our encounter with the Fair Lady is brief, and eventually we return to what we are truly here for, to ring the first bell of awakening, fulfilling one half of Oscar's prophecy left to us at the beginning of the game. In finding the second bell, we have to retrace our steps back to the Undead Burg, and past the Hellkite Drake terrorising the bridge connecting the Burg to the Undead Parish. The parish, as you'd expect, centres around a church. This church used to be a focal point for the old tradition of the Way of the White during Anor Londo's fully theocratic rule. It's thus no surprise that this parish would become a focal point for a group of missionaries from the territory now associated with All-Father Lloyd, this of course being Thoroland. These missionaries that have found their way to Lordran are accompanying a noblewoman and a cleric from Thoroland known as Rhea. Rhea is followed on by Vince, Nico, and of course Petrus. Her three guards give us insight into the militarization of the Way of the White, encouraged by All-Father Lloyd's theocratic independence in Thoroland after leaving Anor Londo. While the Way of the White during its establishment in Anor Londo was purely clerical, in Thoroland they would commonly adorn maces and offensive miracles to enforce their religious beliefs more forcefully. Rhea's story, from the context related to Petrus's dialogue, follows a mission from the government of Thoroland seeking to reclaim the right of kindling that we know was stolen from Nito by Pinwheel. This request likely came about due to the waning First Flame and the effects of hollowing causing harm across Thoroland, and thus in an attempt to preserve humanity and encourage the prophecy of the chosen undead integral to the Way of the White, the reclamation of the right of kindling and thus human proximity to the First Flame through bonfires was paramount to this mission. However, beside these missionaries, we are also made acquainted with Patches. Patches is a recurring character throughout the series and is often underpinned with the concept of nihilism towards the worst excesses of human desire. He suggests clerics more than any other pact of humans are the worst humanity has to offer, as they position themselves as pious and moral, while actually benefiting deeply from the rule and oppression they are legitimized to conduct in the name of religion itself. Patch's story and origins, of course, will be discussed much further in the Dark Souls 3 video, as it fits much better there. But true to Patch's word, we learn these missionaries are not as they appear to be, specifically the lead guard known as Petrus. There are clues early on that allude to Petrus's nature, such as a stash of items in the Firelink Shrine that connect directly to Petrus and the presence of a red eye orb amongst his belongings. And while red eye orbs are often associated with Darkwraiths and their noble cause against the Age of Fire, Petrus, a paladin of the Way of the White, has been using these relics to invade and kill others for his own ends, using the guise of holiness and his elevated position amongst the Thoroland nobility to conduct his actions, later going on to even kill Rhea after Vince and Nico have been left hollowed within the catacombs on their mission towards the right of kindling. True to Patch's statement, this helps us understand the nature of what is left of the old theocratic traditions that once upheld the first Age of Fire. They have been mended, broken, and repaired enough times that they have lost all of their association to the original mission set out by Anor Londo, and now left in the hands of power-hungry opportunists that echo the follies of All-Father Lloyd too. To return to the parish itself, we are given more context of Seat's existing influence through the presence of a channeler, but more importantly we also encounter a Berenique Knight. While immediately aggressive, it's the context of two other Berenique Knights we meet, known as the Crestfallen Merchant and of course Black Iron Tarkus, that teach us two important things. Firstly, the Berenique Knights hail from a part of the world that would become infamous for breeding what the Steel Set describes as the mightiest of the mighty, comparatively placing them as greater than the more common traditions of Astora and even the previously mentioned Thoroland, and even alluding to the idea that there may have been wars between greater nations that allowed for such benchmarking overall. The other important thing we learn is that the Berenique Knights were sent to Lordran as an army to fulfill the undead prophecy and challenge Sen's fortress for an audience with the gods, giving us insight into how desperate the curse of hollowing had already become even before our return to Lordran. Within Sen's fortress, the Undead Merchant and even the Trails of Black Iron Tarkus do lay out a timeline that may suggest we as the player have entered Lordran relatively late, and Lordran at some point may have been filled with great shipments of warriors seeking to be the first to fulfill the Undead prophecy, likely seeking glory that would elevate their nation states. This is further reinforced as we know Berenique was not the only nation to send an army to Lordran to contest Sen's fortress. In fact, another nation known as Boulder would very much do the same. We can find Boulder Knights now scattered across the parish, much like the Berenique Knight, and we are even given direct context that Boulder was led by a Knight King known as Rendal, who would make his way all the way to the Iron Golem and the final obstacle in Sen's fortress, only to be cut down entirely. There's a version of Lordran that was booming with activity, and we may be in our own time witnessing Lordran filled with the failures of thousands of heroes from different parts of the world. Without getting too far ahead of ourselves, within the parish we can also find a prisoner donning a very unique armor set. His name is Lautrec. Lautrec is a man that originates from Carim. To return to what was mentioned about Carim earlier, this region of the world would differ from the other territories such as Thoroland and Astora, as it did away with its initial strong ties to Anor Londo and the Age of Fire after the exodus of Anor Londo. This disconnect allowed Carim to flourish and host a wide array of religious practices, and gave political autonomy for the exile gods to establish themselves as devolved gods in their own right. While we don't know the full extent of how many gods would come to reside in Carim, as mentioned earlier, the god Fina would be one of such a deity. Fina would develop herself as a god of favour and embrace. It's thus not surprising many humans would come to worship her as a deity that offered them solace in a world that only ever advocated for humans as sacrificial fodder. Lautrec was one of these followers. His armour of favour from both Dark Souls 1 and 3 tells us it was modelled to replicate Fina's embrace, her arms protecting and coddling him. Lautrec's armour set and ring indicate Fina directly acknowledged her followers, and in the case of Lautrec even reciprocated her affection by offering an otherworldly blessing of endurance and fortitude. So what is Lautrec doing in the Land of the Lord so far away from Fina's embrace? Well, we learn quickly he's here on a mission, and not the usual mission relative to humans, as he has no intention to link the First Flame or even follow a prophecy regurgitated by the likes of the Way of the White. In fact, on the contrary, Lautrec through the events of the game seems most interested in thwarting the efforts of the maidens aligned to the Age of Fire, whether that's taking the opportunity to kill the Firekeeper of Majula, or perhaps to take advantage of Rhea when she succumbs to the Tomb of the Giants. His actions in his questline will inevitably lead to a confrontation with Lautrec near Guinevere's bedchamber, suggesting he sought not only the demise of Firekeepers, but direct vengeance against Gwyndolin and the remnants of Anor Londo proper. While this seems out of the blue, it may relate to how Fina would come to be viewed by Anor Londo after her exile. In most descriptions of Fina, she is described as the Fickle God, which is no doubt not a moniker she held proudly during her time in Anor Londo, but rather a slight against her character, retroactively placed by Gwyndolin due to the fact that she left Anor Londo and the religion associated with Gwyn's Age of Fire. Lautrec may have believed or was convinced to show his adoration for Fina by exacting vengeance directly upon the remaining Anor Londo bureaucracy, explaining why he would kill the Firekeeper, seeking to untether the means to which any human can go on to participate in the Firelinking cycle, likely as a means to prove to Fina his own allegiance altogether. With this aside, we can make our way up to the Undead Parish to finally reckon with the final Bell of Awakening as detailed in our own prophecy passed down by Oscar. Reaching the bell tower, we are put up against two bell gargoyles. Interestingly, these bell gargoyles are not entirely mechanical beasts, rather they are captive demons taken by Gwyn as a spoil of war from Izalith, duty to protect the tower. It's likely they are well tenured too, as one of the two demons is already somewhat battered and bruised, likely from defeating other great champions who sought the same as we do. This isn't the last time we see these demons either, as we can find them in Anor Londo too. Their fall signifies our triumph, and as the second bell is rung, we are notified by the shifting of the earth that the gates to Sen's fortress, the old proving ground for human chosen undead, are now open for us to contest. On our descent from the bell tower, we are immediately met by a figure adorning black clothes at the bottom of the tower. Upon interaction, he introduces himself as Oswald, another person who originates from Carim. However, unlike the aforementioned Lautrec, Oswald has no affiliation with Fina. Rather, he associates more closely with Velka, one of the greater members of Anor Londo's bureaucracy that brush shoulders with Gwyndolin, assigned to accord punishment and execute Anor Londo's judicial function. As the Blades of the Darkmoon represented Anor Londo's policing presence and its monopoly of power, it's no surprise that there was a huge crossover between Gwyndolin's followers and the followers of Velka too, as both were ingrained in the act of according sin and thus punishment. This connection is most apparent in how the Blades of the Darkmoon sorceries aesthetically come to resemble the purple hue synonymous with Velka. Previously, we spoke about Velka's abandonment of Anor Londo and how she reconstructed her influence in the painted world of Ariamis, but we also mentioned how she would garner followers that resided in two forms. Some would follow her in her new mission within the painted world of Ariamis, while others would remain in the waking world, continuing her efforts and association with Gwyndolin's policing of Lordran. Oswald's connection to Velka appears in many forms. The first most prominent form is Oswald's connection to sin, but also the means for us as a player to pay for our own sins too. Oswald within the game can forgive us for our transgressions against other characters, which plays into his Pardoner moniker. How Oswald has come to maintain such a powerful position within the accordance of sin within the realm of the gods seems to be intimately linked to his own affinity to Velka. While Oswald at face value appears to be just another cleric, once attacked he reveals his true position in Velka's covenant, wielding Velka's rapier and casting miracles directly associated with Velka herself. It's clear he is the most proficient representation of Velka's power still in Lordran. Velka's rapier tells us it is a symbolic, powerful thrusting sword used by the Pardoner serving Velka, goddess of sin. It is no mere symbol to be sure. The Pardoner is an inhuman swordsman and wields this enchanted blade with special sword technique, indicating that Oswald may not have just been a high-ranking member of Velka's covenant, but potentially her singular Pardoner, one that was trusted by Velka to cast pardoning to the guilty, someone who would have won a great deal of respect from Velka to be granted the ability to absolve those of guilt on behalf of her in her own absence. Oswald's presence suggests Velka may have felt some degree of guilt for leaving Anor Londo and particularly leaving Gwyndolin to fend for himself, and thus devolved her powers onto Oswald as a means to preserve Anor Londo's judicial system to maintain the Blade of the Darkmoon's legitimacy. Oswald is in many ways Velka's stand-in, and our route to salvation if we ever find ourselves turning against other characters within the playthrough. Nevertheless, our character carries on and journeys past the parish towards Sen's fortress. However, this isn't before we are made acquainted with a man that calls himself Andre, a blacksmith from the noble Astora. Andre teaches us that Astora was not only beholden to the teachings of Anor Londo and important to the dissemination of Gwyn's prophecy for undead to the wider world, but Astora even sought to replicate Anor Londo's grandeur too. From Oscar, we learn the great Silver Knights of Anor Londo were mimicked in the creation of the Elite Knights in Astora. From Anastasia, the Firekeeper from Majula, we learn that Astorian clerics drew inspiration from Lloyd's old Way of the White in Anor Londo too. But what's important for Andre is the fact that Astora even drew influence in their own artisanal practices from Anor Londo as well. Anor Londo is a monument of distinct architectural design, but outside of their spires and great walls, we learn the armory of the gods were also intentionally designed in a bespoke and inspired manner too. There are even murmurs that suggest a blacksmith deity once looked over the armory of Anor Londo during and after the Great War of Ancients. Anor Londo, being a land of gods, required highly specialised giants to develop their armoury, and while Astora did not have giants at their disposal, their take on blacksmithing didn't diverge too far either, as they too would develop a highly specialised form of smithing that underpinned their knightly tradition of maintaining Anor Londo's influence in the wider world. Their attention to detail would make Asturian craftsmen world-renowned for being able to work on a majority of materials to devise and improve weapons and armour, and while blacksmiths within Astora may have been many, only one rose to the distinction of the giant artisans of Anolondo, this of course being Andre. It's clear even before Andre would find himself near the church in the undead parish, he boasted an expansive career as a blacksmith. This is clear as he's the only human character able to utilise a wide range of embers such as the very large, divine and dark ember, speaking on their properties in a familiar tone and utilising them to craft with ease. It's speculated that Andre is in Lordran for similar reasons to Anastasia. He is here to aid adventurers on their quest to fulfill Gwyn's prophecy and restore the First Flame and undo the undead plague. His dialogue points to this and even gives us reason to believe he is well versed in the theocratic traditions of Anolondo, knowing well the tales of legendary figures, including that of Artorias, the great abyss-walking champion. This proximity to Artorias may even explain why he is able to sell us a seal that allows us further into the Darkroot Gardens, and the eventual tomb of Artorias as well. And thus, taking a diversion from Sen's fortress, we can make our way through the Darkroot Gardens. This place, while seemingly unfamiliar, is actually the old territory of Ulasil from the days of Manas's rise. While overgrown and mostly abandoned, there are remnants of the old civilization that continue to uphold its legacy, namely stone sentinels. However, brushing aside its unkept nature and its clear abandonment altogether after the events of Ulasil's fall, we can finally make it to the sealed door, and upon raising Artorias' seal, we can enter a part of the gardens that are filled with mushroom-like beings that harken back to the great caretaker of Ulasil, Elizabeth, but more importantly the existence of a covenant of warriors aligned to a seemingly divine feline creature that calls herself Alvina. We learn Alvina is from the old era related to the First Age of Fire, and at some point became familiar with the great quartet of knights associated to Gwyn's own roundtable, taking particular fondness towards Artorias. We don't know much about Alvina aside from the fact that she knows of Artorias' great struggle against Manas in Ulasil, and upon his death and the construction of his tomb in Ulasil, she, much like his wolf companion Sif, sought to proclaim these grounds as sacred to Artorias' legacy. Artorias would go down in history as a monumental figure, a beacon of resistance against the darkness Gwyn had already portrayed as a primeval terror, and naturally his legacy would catch the eye of opportunists seeking to pillage his burial site for their own gain. Alvina thus would construct a covenant of fighters to protect the sacred ground from any trespassers, and in the first instance we are seen as such. Upon dispelling the hunters, we can make acquaintance with Alvina, who is eager to have us join the covenant for ourselves. If we agree, we are made colleagues with another group of forest hunters, namely a man named Shiva and his assassin companion, both hailing from the great eastern lands. Alvina refers to Shiva as a shady figure, which likely has to do with the fact that Shiva may have originally come to this land in search of valuable treasure and set his sights on Artorias' tomb. However, much like us, Alvina would be able to convince him to join the Forest Hunter Covenant, something he may have seen as beneficial as it gave him the opportunity to kill and salvage the bodies of the trespassers instead. Shiva and his shadow assassin would accrue immense influence as forest hunters until Alvina would assign Shiva as the captain of the Covenant. We get an idea of the extent to which Shiva had expelled opportunists based on the wares he can sell us in Blighttown, carrying a large variety of items and armory that are immensely rare within this game too. However, it is in fact our encounter with Shiva in Blighttown and clues from cut content that suggest Shiva is not here purely to plunder the wares of undead champions. In fact, he's here for a specific heirloom, the Chaos Blade, a weapon described as inheriting the chaotic nature of Quelaag and a perfect tool to elevate his power as a great leader of the East to that of a legendary warrior of the world. Through his journey, we know Shiva never dies in the canon of Dark Souls 1, unlike most other characters, and likely is the reason why the Chaos Blade recurs throughout the series, as he may have been in fact the one to procure a Soul of Chaos and construct the blade that would outlast Izalith itself. In Dark Souls 3, we can find the Easterner's ashes that shares likeness to his armour. These ashes can be used to purchase the arrows of the Alon Knights, suggesting even Alon may have had some relationship with Shiva in Dark Souls 2. Something that may have led Alon to adopting his Great Cursed Blade that shares gameplay cues to the Chaos Blade as well. Shiva's story is one filled with great power and ambition, and his imagery immortalizes the Great Eastern Lands as one of the greater forces in the wider Souls universe, despite their often isolated nature. As we move forward from the Forest Hunters, we can finally make acquaintance with Artorias' hallowed grave, now guarded over by Sif, his wolf companion that would find solace in the corner of the abyss through Artorias' selfless act to sacrifice his shield to her protection, and eventually saved by the unnamed hero that would lay Artorias and Manus to rest. Sif has grown much since the events of Ulasil, further reinforcing how much time has passed since the events of Manus' rise, and upon Sif's defeat we are granted the Covenant of Artorias, a remnant of Artorias' legacy as Gwyn's oath-bound defender against the dark, and a tool that allows our own player to tread the same grounds. We'll come back to the Darkroot Garden soon, but for now we return to the parish to continue on into Sen's fortress. However, before we do this, we can journey back to Majula for a pick-me-up, and be introduced to a serpent that has risen from the ground. This is the legendary primordial serpent that once counselled Gwyn and helped coordinate the propaganda campaign to retain the Age of Fire in perpetuity, and thus, as discussed much earlier in the video, regurgitates Gwyn's prophecy of an undead champion to follow in his stead, guiding us towards Sen's fortress and Anor Londo to claim the Lord Vessel, an object created to harness the soul of Gwyn's devolved soul in Seath and the Four Kings, but also the Lord Souls of Nito and Izalith too, in an effort to take Gwyn's place and resurrect the Age of Fire for a third time. So we naturally set off towards Sen's fortress, immediately being met with traps and the serpents birthed from Seath's twisted experiments into immortality. Sen's fortress seeks to address all sorts of capabilities, from endurance, perception and strength. It's no surprise the Great Boulder and Berenique Knights mostly met their end within the walls of this fortress. However, as we venture through, we learn we are not the only person currently attempting the gauntlet, as soon enough we come across Sigmaya. Depending on the route you take, you could have met Sigmaya before opening Sen's fortress, as he stands waiting outside unsure as to how or when the gates are due to open. This makes clear Sigmaya is in Lordran not on a quest inspired from the stories of an undead prophecy, rather here to prove himself as a great warrior. Sigmaya comes from a distant land known as Katarina. Prior to Sen's fortress, he tells us he came to Lordran in search of untold adventures that would prove his knightly status. Through the context of the series, we know Katarinians aren't necessarily known homogeneously as a warrior class of people. Rather, it hosted a culture that enjoyed festivities and had deep longing for community. For this reason, Sigmaya seems incredibly courteous towards the player, but as we learn very early on, is entirely misled in believing he had what it took to contest Lordran and come home victorious, as even the first hurdle requires player intervention, something that becomes a recurring theme in his questline. He follows our player through Sen's fortress and even requires our player's intervention to progress any further than the fortress too. Naturally, as is everything relative to Dark Souls, his demise is inevitable, whether granted a warrior's end in Izalith Swamp or at the hands of his daughter Sieglind, who has ventured after her father in an effort to bring him home, knowing he isn't fit for the challenge. However, what both the story of Sieglind and Sigmaya teach us is that Katarina is a unique place in the world of Dark Souls, as it built a culture not just around how powerful they were, or perhaps how religious they came to be, or even what deity they aligned with. Rather, their culture was built on a purely human North Star, priding company, festivities and joyful banter at its centre. However, Sigmaya is not the only person we need to help within Sen's fortress, as within its walls we can also find the infamous Big Hat Logan, the same Logan that once studied within the walls of Vinheim's prestigious dragon school, only to quickly rise its ladder to the top of the institution, revolutionising all forms of sorcery whilst he did so. Our encounter with Logan dispels quite a bit of the myth already brought to our attention through Grigg's story, as he seems quite aloof and his armour even describes Logan as dirty and unwashed, and often lost in his own thoughts, donning his iconic hat not as a point of his distinction, but to ward off the eyes of his peers. We learn Logan's time within the Dragon Academy was relatively short, and how he had already accomplished so much in so little time that his name, even from within the confines of the Academy itself, would make its way across the globe, where even the crestfallen warrior recounts his legacy too. The crestfallen warrior even issues a statement that suggests many looked upon the myth of Big Hat Logan as adjacent to the very gods. However, upon meeting Logan, it's clear Logan does not think of himself in the same manner. In fact, he accepts his flaws as a human and is in Lordran seeking more knowledge in sorcery to elevate his own understanding deeper. And of course, no other place would offer such a platform than the birthplace of sorcery itself, Lordran, and more specifically the Duke's archives and the residence of Seat the Paledrake, the figure that inspired Vinheim's own sorcery tradition and the namesake of the Academy. We find Logan trapped in a cellar. While this may come as a surprise to those familiar with Logan's power, the description of the cage key alludes to the idea that Logan, being as intelligent as he was, intentionally chose to be captured on the premise he would be taken directly to Seat's archives as experiment fodder. Unfortunately for Logan, it appears he failed to account for the fact that he may have been altogether forgotten by Seat's servants and would remain in the cage indefinitely. Thankfully for him, we can of course release Logan and set him on his own path to the Duke's archives. If we follow this thread, we can eventually find Logan having made his home in the archive studies. Here he would teach himself of Seat's work on sorcery and even begin to understand the properties of crystals in his own work, reinforcing his spells with crystal features. The Crystal Soul Spear directly suggests he had attained a level of power on par with the armaments of the Ancient Lords. Interesting wording, as the description of the regular Soul Spear tells us it is said to be on par with Gwyn's lightning, suggesting Logan had indeed actualized the power of gods like the myths initially believed he had already done. Logan's endeavours would eventually culminate into the perfect spell and a symbol to push this theory further, this of course being the White Dragon Breath spells, described as a replication of the power of ancient dragons and the raw strength of Seath himself. While Logan would succumb to the madness associated with the power of crystals and Seath, he would live on through the spells he would learn, likely having disseminated his teachings to our chosen hero who would bring them to the wider world, before he personally succumbed to his maddened state. It's thus not surprising that the entirety of the spellcasting traditions through the trilogy would be underpinned by Logan henceforth. We learn some of the most influential sorcerers would continue to share Logan's ideals and even bear aesthetic similarities to him. Considering eons would pass between the first and final installment, his successors in the form of the Preacher Twins, aka the Crystal Sages, and even Osiris, show this to be true. Putting Logan's story aside, as we venture through Sen's Fortress, we can find the remnants of the last heroes who failed to challenge the gauntlet. In one instance, we can meet the previously mentioned crestfallen merchant and Berenique champion who failed to challenge the fortress, eventually left alone salvaging what he could to remain alive. And in another instance, we can find the great Prince Rickard and the Asturian royalty that would seek out Sen's Fortress on a hero's journey to prove to the population how legitimate his status was, only to fall short and never return home. However, amongst all these failures, we do find one person, or more accurately the summon sign of an individual, that did successfully challenge Sen's Fortress, this being Black Iron Tarkus. As previously mentioned, Tarkus was a member of the Berenique campaign towards Lordran. The description of his armor set tells us of the story of a man who rose above his Berenique peers, able to wear even heavier armor than the already monstrous Iron Knight set with great ease. The Greatsword goes on to give us further insight about how the Berenique fighting style may have been popularised by Tarkus himself. It reads, a favourite of the Knights Berenique, known for their heavy armour and Black Iron Tarkus, drawing close attention to the idea that the Berenique knightly tradition owes its popularity to Tarkus by name. Thus, while his peers would fall one by one as they progressed the fortress, Tarkus would make it to the Iron Golem, and even best it all by himself, eventually making it to Anor Londo. If you want to see how he did it, you can actually just summon him for the fight and sit back. However, in what is likely the most anticlimactic event in the entire game, he would fall off the rafters in Anor Londo, dying to what is likely the Painting Guardians and the environment, as we can find his armour on the ground here. Naturally, the next step for our player is to face off the golem for ourselves, and in this moment we are reckoning with one of Gwyndelyn's most important tests for the Chosen Undead, an automaton built on the bones of everlasting dragons, the details of which I won't repeat again as it was explored earlier. Nevertheless, after the Iron Golem's eventual demise, we are taken captive by yet more captive demons from Izalith, taken as spoils by Gwyn after claiming victory in his war against the Bed of Chaos. These demons carry our player all the way over the walls of Anor Londo. From the offset, this kingdom of the gods seems to be far from the tales the wider world believed it to be. The birthplace of the Age of Fire and the cultural cornerstone to most kingdoms far and wide has clearly been rendered down to its final core component, a vehicle to perpetuate the cycle once set in motion by Gwyn. It's thus unsurprising the remaining residents of this land are a few guardians that ensure all those that set foot in this land come with the sole intention to follow through on the undead prophecy. In the early sections of Anor Londo, we get glimpses of how entrenched Gwyn and his theocratic rule were, scattered with churches that bear his imagery everywhere we go. These structures are guarded over by what we learn are giants adorned with the armour of paladins. While we haven't spoken of giants outside of Goth and the legendary smiths of the gods, we learn giants even as far back as the creation of Sen's Fortress were used as menial labour by the gods to produce their magnificent architecture. While we'll hold off on the story of giants for Dark Souls 2, it's clear Anor Londo, even in the heyday of Gwyn's rule during the First Age of Fire, wasn't averse to conducting themselves in a manner that was classist. However, as was the case for many other repressed classes, some giants would be naturally elevated beyond their inherited status, one of which would be a giant we can meet known only as the Giant Blacksmith, an artisan of the gods that is suggested to have been the being responsible for adorning the gods in special armoury that even hold lightning characteristics born from Gwyn's own image, and unique armoury that bared the power of godly souls too. Soon we come across the final Firekeeper relative to our journey. She is known only as the Dark Moon Knightess, and for the Vigilant you'll remember that the Dark Moon Warriors are all of course relative to Gwendolyn's secret police network that held Anor Londo's current monopoly of power. However, the Dark Moon Knightess does not originate from these lands, and like many other undead contenders, came to Lordran likely seeking to fulfill the undead prophecy. Our biggest clue as to her heritage actually comes from one of her weapons, the Parrying Dagger, a weapon used exclusively by knights associated to Karim. Her armour tells us of a story of an undead champion that came from Karim and successfully contended Sen's Fortress, and upon being one of the first and few to enter Anor Londo, would make an audience with Gwendolyn only to find herself deeply enamoured by Gwendolyn's covenant of the Dark Moon Warriors, going on to win a degree of trust from the deity and eventually take residence as both a firekeeper to usher undead champions through Anor Londo, but also guard against any delinquent behaviour so close to the capital of the Age of Fire. The Dark Moon Knightess would climb the rank of Gwendolyn's covenant and would even learn of Anor Londo's most prized secret, that Anor Londo's sun was nothing but an illusion, and the fact that the Age of Fire was nearing its end and Gwendolyn was responsible for retaining the aesthetics of Anor Londo, be that the illusion of the sun or be that the illusion of Guinevere, to offer further legitimacy and power to the undead prophecy and the perceived omnipresence of Gwyn's old bureaucracy. There's a sequence of events where the Dark Moon Knightess hunts the chosen undead if the player acts out against Gwyndolin's rule, particularly dispelling the illusion of Guinevere. Nevertheless, keeping peace with the Dark Moon Knightess, our player ventures on, scaling the walls of Anor Londo like Tarkus before, but this time doing so successfully and coming up against the Painting Guardians. As discussed earlier in the video, these Painting Guardians were dutied with keeping a plane of existence commissioned by Gwyn safe. This place would become Gwyn's dumping ground for all elements he believed threatened the Age of Fire's hegemony. This place is of course the painted world of Artorias. Tackling these guardians, we can ourselves be met by the huge painting, and if the player had backtracked back to the Undead Asylum and picked up a peculiar doll associated with the previously mentioned Priscilla's childhood cell, they can be granted access to this world. Immediately we are met with a dilapidated bridge, and it's clear now that we have entered this land, our way out will not be as easy as our way in. Forging on, we can meet a plethora of undead beings, distinctly different to those we meet in Lordran. As you'd expect, this world has been here for a long time, and what appears to be a somewhat cohesive order has emerged from this great dumping ground. Statues of Velka watch over this land, and an eerie peace seems to have settled amongst the residents once deemed unnecessary for the wider world. Velka's image in this world does away with much of what we have come to expect in Lordran. She no longer is the arbiter of the guilty, rather has become solace for the oppressed. While Velka is no longer amongst this world, we do find crow-like beings occupying and seemingly governing the territory in her stead. We learn crow imagery would become synonymous with this new version of Velka, her legacy entrenched in offering peace to the weak, a legacy that would come to bind the Sisters of Londor in the third installment as they raged against the dying Age of Fire. This isn't surprising, as it's clear from this painted world that Velka's blessings have far exceeded the strict theocratic line of Anor Londo, offering salvation to the undead, contrasting against Gwyn's persecution and imprisonment. Additionally, we can even find torn everlasting dragons finding solace in this world too, to make the point further. While Velka's personal presence is nowhere to be seen, at the very end of our journey through Artorias, we are introduced to the Great Priscilla, the crossbreed that carried the soul of Gwyn through Seat's devolved power, and the lineage of what is presumed to be a princess of Gwyn's realm, a direct lineation. Priscilla was born as an experiment by Seath, and despite her troubled origins with incestuous themes and a traumatic youth where she would be left to rot in a cell from her early childhood, she carried the power to exact vengeance against the very gods that sanctioned such actions. However, Priscilla was a being of immense kindness. Understanding we may have stumbled upon this world, she offers us a way home, inferring she too could return to this wider world, but continues to choose against vengeance. If we mistaken her kindness for weakness and attack Priscilla, we have to reckon with the extremely unique powers relative only to her, specifically the power of Life Hunt, the twisted strength that could even bring the gods to their knees, born from the union of Gwyn's soul and the soul of what can be speculated to be his daughter. Her body resembled this union too. She carries weakened legs, the paleness of Seat's albinism, and even a tail too. This is not a battle anyone should elect to take on, and thus we can take Priscilla's word and leave this realm for good, allowing peace to exist in at least a small part of the world, far away from the sins of Gwyn. Painted worlds acting as a vacuum for peace detached from Gwyn's cycle will of course become an immensely important theme in the final installment, but for now we can carry forward. Re-entering Lordran proper, we can make our way towards the great castle of the gods in Anor Londo, and even come face to face with some of the legendary Silver Knights that once stood beside Gwyn during the pivotal moments of the Age of Ancients. Getting past these knights, we can finally get an audience with the true guardians of Anor Londo, Ornstein and Smaug. As mentioned earlier, Ornstein was a member of Gwyn's fabled quartet of knights. In fact, he would rise to the station as the de facto captain of the four, likely due to his involvement with the Nameless King during the Nameless King's time as Anor Londo's great god of war. Beside Ornstein were Smaug. Smaug's story is a little different from Ornstein's, as his hammer tells us that Smaug had all the makings to be knighted amongst Gwyn's round table of knights, but he had a bad habit of grounding the bones of those he was assigned to execute into his own feed, a clear optics issue for the purity at the heart of Anor Londo's theocratic rule. While seemingly an unusual pairing, we do know the quartet of knights associated to Gwyn at this point in the timeline had indeed been rendered down into just Ornstein himself, as Kiran, Artorias and Goff were all caught up and left to the events of Ulasil and Manas's rise, and Smaug may have been the only option left for Gwyndolin, as he had not left Anor Londo during its great exodus, and had accumulated immense strength due to his consumption of victims. We learn Anor Londo taking advantage of similar types of beings in the case of Aldrich in Dark Souls 3, so it's not a stretch to believe this trend may have first been legitimized by Smaug's elevation. What's interesting about the relationship with the Exodus and of course Ornstein and Smaug is that there are genuinely plausible theories that suggest Ornstein had also left Anor Londo during this time, on a journey to seek out the Nameless King after he had rescinded his throne, and Ornstein in Anor Londo proper may just be another illusion conjured by Gwyndolin after the Exodus. The most compelling piece of context relating to this is that we can find Ornstein's golden armor in Dark Souls 3 near the Nameless King boss battle. Timelines can make things muddy here, where we can argue when Ornstein would leave his station, suggesting it may be the true Ornstein during the events of the first game, and how he would leave Anor Londo only after the events of the first game, but theoretically it wouldn't make any sense, as Ornstein would have to canonically die for the events of the first game to progress, in the same way we know Smaug had died. And of course we as the player are the ones to bring them down, and upon their defeat we are finally granted an audience with the illusion of Guinevere, and are granted the Lord Vessel, a means to collect and harness the power of Gwyn's devolved soul and the power of the remaining gods to reenact Gwyn's ultimate sacrifice. Bringing the Lord Vessel back to Frampt, we are informed that the way of the Lords has opened for us, and our next task will be the most trying of them all. We are required to forcefully hunt the souls of the primordial lords. For our first stop, we head towards the city that once stood beside Anor Londo, a city once granted to the 4 Pygmy Kings, New Londo. Our adventure into New Londo gives us first-hand accounts of the sheer devastation enacted by Gwyn during his preemptive smothering of the city when informed of their secret plot to weaponize the Dark Soul against the Age of Fire. This sunken city is littered predominantly with the tortured souls of the inhabitants who had to pay the ultimate price. The scale of the deaths from environmental clues and the sheer amount of ghosts makes it clear this may have been Gwyn's most violent action ever, and acted as a turning point as to what Gwyn was willing to do to fight against the natural turning of ages. Accepting a transient curse, we can interact and dispel these vengeful spirits and make it to a building where a man named Ingward stands watching over the flooded city. Ingward's origins are hard to know for certain, but we do know he is referred to as a banishment sorcerer. The Tin Banishment Catalyst suggests Ingward is the final remaining sorcerer of this tradition, and how this faction of sorcerers may have first been commissioned by Gwyn to watch over the remnants of New Londo, and particularly the remaining influence of the 4 Kings and the Darkwraith Covenant, and thus were highly specialised with combating the remaining Darkwraiths that still roam the land. Interestingly, Ingward wears a necklace that appears to be a crescent moon, giving us an idea of where Gwyn would initially recruit these sorcerers, pointing directly to the Dark Moon Covenant, and thus the Banishment Sorcerers may have initially been a Dark Moon task force that would only later become an institution of their own as the threats of the Darkwraiths were better understood. This is played further into for some of Ingward's own cut content, where he commends the player for killing a rogue Darkwraith that had escaped New Londo's ruins. Nevertheless, with the Lord Vessel in our possession, Ingward gladly grants us a means to relieve New Londo of its flood, to go below and challenge the 4 Kings for their soul, aware of the undead prophecy and context to suggest he was familiar and still connected to Gwyndolin's mission. So we go on to undo the seal to enter New Londo proper. Immediately the extent of Gwyn's actions are made further clear to us, as the bottom of New Londo carries heaps of dead bodies, perhaps the greatest accumulation of death within the entire franchise. Further on, we can encounter some of the bona fide Darkwraiths spoken of earlier, and as you'd expect, they wield a unique power of life drain, once bestowed upon the Four Kings by Karth, and then disseminated onto New Londo's great warriors to enact the ultimate goal of gathering the Dark Soul to be weaponized against the Age of Fire. The Darkwraiths can, as you'd expect, use this power against us, as for them, despite our status as humans, we are standing against their ultimate goal against the Age of Fire. Defeating them eventually leads us to the Abyss, a place we are now able to traverse due to the Covenant of Artorias we found way back in Artorias' burial site. Taking the ring, we descend into the Abyss and current residence of the Four Kings. We learn the Four Kings endured the flood by burying themselves deep below the ground, a place that only knew darkness, a place not dissimilar to the grounds the furtive pygmy itself once resided in during the first moments of the Age of Fire. With their own unique ability of life drain, they pose an immense threat, but with all the plot armor in the world, we can defeat them, gathering their soul filled with both the captured humanity of many adversaries, but also a portion of Gwyn's devolved soul once granted to the kings for their contribution during the War of Ancients when they stood side by side against the everlasting dragons. However, the death of the Four Kings for most playthroughs is just another Lord Soul ticked off the list, but if our player had instead made their way to New Londo prior to an audience with Frampt and even the acquisition of the Lord Vessel, instead gaining the seal from Ingward with force, when the Four Kings are defeated, we can ourselves be greeted after the battle by Darkstalker Karth, the same primordial serpent that sought to balance Frampt's support of Gwyn by enlightening humans as to the nature of Gwyn's oppression of humans and the nature of the Dark Sign itself. Karth is eager to meet us, believing our power to overcome the Four Kings and our inherent link to humanity and the Dark Soul offers us a unique position in challenging the order of the Age of Fire itself. Karth is quick to enlighten us, as he had both Manus and the Four Kings, about Gwyn's actions against humanity, his desperate plea to maintain order despite nature's course, and how his propaganda campaign was created purely to subvert true human potential away from accepting our role as the successors of the Age of Fire. For most people, this will be the first time we encounter this counter-narrative. By this point in any blind playthrough, we would have already been fed the propaganda of the prophecy of chosen undeads, the idea that we are acting selflessly on behalf of all humans by choosing to preserve the Age of Fire. Naturally, we as the player, having been offered this enlightenment but tainted by the prevailing tones of Gwyn's prophecy, will, even as a player, feel skeptical towards the words of Karth. This is intentional and is perfect game design to put us in the shoes of the Four Kings, who too once were approached by this serpent with these words of enlightenment. If we, like the Four Kings, choose to accept Karth's words as true, shrugging away the pervasiveness of Gwyn's narrative for chosen undeads, we are granted the power of life drain and the means to take a hold of humanity and weaponize it against the gods, a means to reject the First Flame and conquer the Lord Souls, ensuring the Age of Fire's forced heat death. However, for now, let's park Karth's mission and continue on as our chosen hero taking the path of least resistance. The death of the Four Kings would bring us back to Majula and ready to begin our trek towards the catacombs and Nito's hideaway. On our route to the catacombs, we passed through a large gravesite, proving again how Nito's duty was to offer true death to humans in accordance to the disparity crucial to the Age of Fire. Within the tombs itself, we are met by many skeletons reborn from death, likely as a defense mechanism to keep the sacred site safe, ordered to reanimate by shamans under Nito's control, or perhaps a byproduct of the Age of Fire waning and the concept of proper death and the disparity of life and death being blurred due to its fading. While the catacombs are winding and easy to get lost in, we eventually come to a passageway that leads us to the aforementioned Pinwheel's domain. But before this, we can find a summon sign of a peculiar paladin known as Leroy. While initially seeming as to be any ordinary summon sign of a chosen hero who had lost themselves to the prophecy of the undead champions, Leroy is actually far more important. Within the timeline of the game, we're told Leroy may have been one of the first humans in the entire game to start showing signs of hollowing, and may have been the first to venture into Lordran to seek absolution through the rite of kindling the first flame. As mentioned earlier, Thorolund was something of the Vatican when it came to the theology relative to the Age of Fire, as Allfather Lloyd had developed Thorolund under the pretense of disseminating Anolondo's theocratic rule to the wider world. It's thus not surprising therefore to find that upon finding out Leroy's hollowing form, he would be given no choice but to venture into Lordran to enact the undead prophecy. While we don't know what kind of man Leroy was before becoming undead, there are clues that suggest he was already both an incredibly spiritual figure, but also inhumanly strong. For the Way of the White, this may have seemed like a perfect turn of events, and Leroy's hollowing form was miraculous in and of itself. Much like the Kingdom of Lothric in Dark Souls 3, Allfather Lloyd's government may have believed Leroy was a divine sign that Thorolund was to birth Gwyn's successor, and thus they would construct Leroy's armour and weaponry as supremely divine and built around Leroy's strength, and existed as a representation of Thorolund's growing holy order of knights. We don't know specifically the details of Leroy's journey, but we do know from the encounters we can have with Leroy's phantoms within the game, he had made a successful descent into the catacombs, seemingly warding off Pinwheel and even confronting Nito himself, only to die at Nito's hands. We know this to be true as we can find Leroy's armour within Nito's boss room. Despite Leroy's historic presence, there is very little human activity within the walls of the tombs. However, hidden behind a crashed wall, we can find a sentient being that offers blacksmithing services. He calls himself Vamos. While Vamos is a character of very little words, he does offer conversation on embers, specifically embers with an association to Izalith. Vamos stands as the most proficient blacksmith in this area, and is the only character able to make use of Chaos Embers to enhance weapons with its traits. This could indicate two things. He either is intimately affiliated with the Izalith clan from the primordial days, or was an apprentice of another who was. However, granting Vamos the Chaos Ember does indicate the former, as he doesn't recognise the Chaos Flame but can pinpoint its origins to Izalith herself, suggesting he knows well the original fire sorcery of the primordial days so well he can associate it directly with the witch herself prior to her transformation into the Bed of Chaos. In the design phase of Dark Souls 1, Vamos was suggested to have worn an item known as the Royal Helm. While the Royal Helm itself made it to the game, he never wears it, but does drop the item on death. The helm's description reads, Helm of Vamos, skeleton blacksmith of the catacombs, partially made of gold. This helm is believed to belong to an ancient royal line, but only Vamos would know for sure, and he shall never speak again, suggesting the helm both belongs to an ancient royal family, but also intimately referred to as Vamos's own helmet. In this, we can further assure that Vamos must have been both closely affiliated to the primordial Izalith, but also a royal member of a clan, pointing towards his lineage tying firmly within Izalith's realm. Being referred to as a skeleton adds further credit, as he is clearly an ancient being himself. Putting the encounter with Vamos behind us, we eventually end up confronting Pinwheel. Pinwheel, as discussed earlier, is the being that once stole the Rite of Kindling from Nito in a convoluted attempt to reanimate his dead family, only for this ritual to leave him a malformed version of his own family, born into one twisted body. With Pinwheel's fall, we can ourselves lay claim to the Rite of Kindling and reissue this power back to the bonfires connected to the First Flame, invigorating all bonfires with a closer proximity to the First Flame and hosting a brighter fire altogether. This brighter fire would come with greater restorative properties, giving us all we need to go further through the catacombs until we approach the Giant's Tomb. The Giant's Tomb, much like other parts of the catacombs, was specifically crafted to issue death and burial to the giants that would aid the Age of Fire. Much like the humanoid skeletons, they have been reanimated to act as guardians of the tomb too. As we progress on, we can find the true extent to Pinwheel's presence in these tombs, as it's clear his tenure as a necromancer who harboured a portion of Nito's power has led to a coven of servants to bear Pinwheel's imagery and impose his presence all the way up until Nito's domain. leading us to Nito himself. Nito, as he always had since the emergence of the Age of Fire and the events following the War of Ancients, has resigned himself to the catacombs as his permanent residence. Within this area, he conducts the current Covenant of the Gravelord Servants, issuing proper death throughout Lordran, something we ourselves can join if we meet Nito prior to obtaining the Lord Vessel. Carrying the power of miasma once great enough to bring down everlasting dragons and a cohort of skeletons at his command, we finally get a chance to reckon with Nito himself, and upon his corpse we are granted the great immensity of his Lord Soul, marking victory over 2 of the required 4 souls. Our next stop is returning to Izalith, but before we go there, we enter Blighttown and take a different route, leading us through an illusory tree until we enter a place known as Ash Lake, a secret secluded part of the world that seems to harbour aesthetic similarities to the Age of Ancients, with trees spouting far beyond the skies. However, Ash Lake's similarities to the Age of Ancients doesn't end here, as tucked away in a corner of this region, we can find what appears to be a true everlasting dragon of stone. Unsurprisingly, this being is known as the Stone Dragon, an extremely close descendant of the true everlasting dragons that has found a corner of the world far away from the peering eyes of the ancient lords. The Stone Dragon is completely disinterested in engaging in any form of combat, as unlike most descendants of everlasting dragons, it appears to have inherited the stone scales of immortality its ancestors were most known for. Dragon descendants that currently occupy the post-Age of Ancients landscape often represent the more vengeful and antagonistic traits of the everlasting dragons, be that Kalamit's undying rage or even the drakes that plague the undead Berg. However, the Stone Dragon, on the contrary, seems to have adopted the more stoic and elemental characteristics of the everlasting dragons, far more in tune with the archtrees of their original biome. This elemental proximity to the everlasting dragons has meant the Stone Dragon was comfortable living on the sidelines of the world, and in due time some would come to find the ancient dragon and be enamoured by its ability to live outside the confines of the Age of Fire. This would turn into a reverence for the dragon, a reverence that would spur the creation of a covenant bound to worshipping this beast. The Stone Dragon would reciprocate this affection to its worshippers and even offer a means to transform humans into dragon hybrids. This theme of humans looking towards dragons as a means to live outside the cycle of the Age of Fire is one that would carry through all games hitherto, be that Aldia's experiments with dragon bones and the creation of the false everlasting dragon as a means to understand the Hollowing Curse in Dark Souls 2, or even Osiris's spiral into madness after realizing his child was born disabled and unable to link the first flame, eventually looking towards dragonhood for redemption. We'll explore the nature of dragonhood further on, but despite this encounter's brief respite from the game proper, its themes will echo in following installments. Returning to Blighttown, we can finally make our way to Izalith. Izalith's terrain is a hellscape, currently under a flow of lava that makes traversing its grounds near impossible. However, luckily for the player, we can find a being known as the Ceaseless Discharge, yet another unfortunate consequence of Izalith's transformation, and suggested to be one of Izalith's children who clings onto life near Lost Izalith's entrance. The Ceaseless Discharge, being a child of Izalith, would become a focal point for the Witch Daughters, as they would deeply empathise with his suffering. We're told a ring would be constructed to help their brother endure the radiating pain of its existence. This is important for us as we require this ring to help us confront Izalith past the swathes of lava. Granting a merciful death to the Ceaseless Discharge and the reduction of flowing lava from its tendrils, we're able to make it through Lost Izalith and confront the Centipede Demon, a portion of the Ceaseless Discharge's body that had fallen into the lava of Lost Izalith and brought to individual sentience, likely due to being bound by the orange charred ring once held by the Ceaseless Discharge. The Centipede Demon's death grants us the ring and the ability to walk on the lava without mortally wounding ourselves, giving us a clear pathway through Lost Izalith and towards Izalith herself. On our way there, it would be amiss not to recognise what has become of Lost Izalith, as it's clear while the population have been dismissed as monstrous demons, it's clear a culture has emerged here amongst the demons. Whether this is the distinct architecture or perhaps the rank and file of demons, it's easy to dismiss the demon race as a nuisance from the stories of Gwyn's crusade. But in truth, they, much like other beings oppressed by the Age of Fire, are just looking for a part of the world where they can exist without persecution. Something the Witch Daughters also acknowledge, as despite being decimated by the mutating Chaos Flame, sought to rebuild a society around these mutations, and even revered the newfound strength of Izalith as she transformed into the Bed of Chaos. As we make our way through the flames of Izalith, we can even encounter a Witch Daughter protecting the Bed of Chaos's domain, and upon defeating this Chaos Witch, we are finally granted an audience with the mutated behemoth and mother of all demons, Izalith herself, now known as the Bed of Chaos. Izalith herself has been transformed into a small bug, but from her a great tendril of flames has emerged. Navigating around these tendrils, we finally break through the Chaos Flame and land a killing blow to her new parasitic form, and from her body we gain Izalith's soul. With 3 of the great souls now in tow, we make our return to Anor Londo, this time with a different mission, to challenge Seath and the Duke of the Duke's archives. Making our way through the archives, we learn quickly that Seath's experiments have overrun the archives, whether that's the twisted experimentation with crystals, leaving a group of humans hollowed and crystallized forced to act as guards, or the channelers that look after the studies, ensuring Seath's omnipresent influence. Riddled with books and all forms of studious tools, it's clear Seath spent a great majority of his time collecting as much knowledge as he could into crafting his own immortality, seeking to reconcile his own mortality with the immortality of his kin. We can meet Seath early on within the archives, and from this encounter it would be easy to assume he has very much attained this immortality. His physical body, impervious to damage, leads to our own capture, where we're left in a cell seemingly as further experiment fodder for his twisted research. This jailhouse is filled with cells and unfortunate hollows. It's guarded by serpent men identical to those found in Sen's fortress. We are now in Seath's holding grounds, but thankfully we can find a means to escape our cell and are immediately met with Pisakas, the remnants of the experiments he conducted against the maidens from wider Lordran, and likely the same experiments Havel would detest, leading to the previously mentioned occult rebellion. Our escape from these holding cells returns us to another section of the archives, and we are met with a vista that really encapsulates the scale of Seath's experiments with crystals. It's clear his research has led to the creation of an entire biome of crystallids, be that golems or butterflies. If Seath has attained immortality, it's clearly linked to this crystallized environment, and thus we make our way through the archives until we reach this biome. Navigating this area makes clear it was never intended for trespassers and purely created for Seath and only Seath himself. Reaching the end of these tunnels, we reach a large crystal room that holds the answer to how Seath has obtained his immortality, a crystal stone, a Horcrux of sorts. Seath, during the end of the Age of Ancients, much like Gwyn, kept an important heirloom of this past civilization. Likely understanding the machinations better than all others, he would keep a hold of a primordial stone. This stone would later hold the answers to Seath's ambitions for immortality, as he would harness its powers and crystallize its form to bind to his own body to form a pseudo-everlasting trait. Destroying this relic brings upon the ire of the Duke, and we are forced to reckon with Seath, but this time on a mortal playing field. It's clear Seath's crystals have taken a cursed property, perhaps the primary reason why its studies often led to madness, the same madness that has taken a hold of Big Hat Logan, and the same madness associated with Osiris in the 3rd installment. While scholars in the 3rd game have found a means to averting madness while researching and handling crystals by waxing their own heads, in our battle we have to reckon with its raw power, and in doing so we can land a killing blow to the dragon that feared death more than anything else, and finally capture the last major portion of Gwyn's soul necessary to harness before confronting the first flame itself. However, before returning to the Lord Vessel and on our way out of the Duke's archives, we encounter a peculiar golem that drops a pendant that holds an eerie energy of darkness, one all too familiar with our own humanity. The pendant compels us towards the Darkroot Basin until we reach a colossal hydra. Carrying the power of gods, it's not difficult to overcome, and behind this monster we are introduced to a woman who calls herself Dusk of Ulasil. As mentioned earlier, Ulasil is an entirely historic region that has now been long forgotten to the annals of time, and thus Dusk, if truly from Ulasil, has somehow survived the events of the great tragedy of Manus, or perhaps found herself having fallen through time. Dusk thanks us for rescuing her. While initially we are to believe she is referring to being rescued from the crystal golem she emerged from, in fact there may be a double meaning here, as she goes on to request we travel back in time to Ulasil to save the city from Manus, and save her from captivity from this ancient evil that is threatening the kingdom. Accepting her plea, we venture forward until we approach a void in this world, a void that causes a large arm to grab us and bring us to a time adjacent to the first age of fire. As we make our way through Ulasil, we are immediately confronted by the Sanctuary Guardian. This Guardian is referred to by the game as more demon than wild beast. Thus, the Sanctuary Guardian is not unlike other demons of the game who found themselves far away from the bed of chaos as a spoil of war from Gwyn's crusade against Izalith. This demon, however, was set with a very specific task related to Gwyn's initial attempt to understand and ward off the growing abyss in Ulasil, not unlike other missionaries sent to the region like Artorias and of course Goth. It's clear we haven't just entered Ulasil during any moment in history. In fact, we're here during the pinnacle of Manus' rise, and just as Dusk had mentioned, at a crucial juncture for Ulasil's legacy. We can see Gwyn's direct influence in the Sanctuary Guardian through its proficiency in lightning, and upon defeating the beast we are granted access to Ulasil proper, and a peculiar talking mushroom known as Elizabeth. Mushroom people are, however, not unfamiliar to our own playable character, as we can find sentient mushrooms all over the Darkroot Gardens. However, from the description of the Elizabeth mushroom item, we know this specific sentient mushroom may be the progenitor of these peculiar creatures. Elizabeth's own story, as you'd imagine, is inherently tied to the story of Ulasil. As discussed, Ulasil was a place full of life, vegetation, and even rich cultural traditions. In Ulasil, beings known as mystics would populate the land and develop golden sorceries. As Ulasil preceded the events of the main game and even the rise of Manus, Ulasil was able to grow during an era of peacetime. Echoing the zeitgeist of this era, golden sorcery was inherently non-offensive in every form, as there was no reason to be, as Ulasil's population were made up of farmers, guardians, and mystics in complete harmony with their surroundings. It's thus not surprising that Elizabeth, a seemingly benevolent character, is introduced to us as Ulasil's historic guardian. This guardianship likely referred less to defensive posturing and more to do with how she was likely the governor of the sanctuary's bureaucracy and a trusted confidant of its population. Naturally, she was in tune with Ulasil's wider population for this reason, and even one with the mystics of this region, as she can teach us the golden sorceries native to the area, despite most mystics having unfortunately succumbed to the power of Manus by the time of our arrival. Elizabeth echoes the sentiment of the Rising Darkness as an inherently evil thing to be undone, and suggests she may have been the person to issue warning signs to Anor Londo and directly to Gwyn on the Abyss's rise. Naturally, Elizabeth shepherds our character towards the Abyss, believing we are an agent of Gwyn sent to deal with Manus, likely taking after Artorias, who she recounts as having walked these same grounds with the same mission. With Elizabeth's blessings, we trek on and through Ulasil's lush woodlands. Ulasil in these days, when compared to what has become of the Darkroot Gardens, is full of life, vegetation, and a farming population still attempting to get on with their lives. However, in certain portions of even the woods, we can find darkness seeping forward as if to foreshadow what will become of this land and to verify Elizabeth's concern of the growing abyss. In the throes of the Abyss's awakening and the township being overrun by Manus, Ulasil has been left in turmoil. Enough turmoil that a close descendant of the everlasting dragons, hell-bent on making Gwyn's regime pay, has found a home in Ulasil, adding a further layer of uncertainty to the future of Ulasil's place in this world. We get a glimpse of this dragon early on, terrorizing the land freely. This dragon is known as Kalameet, referred to as an ancient dragon in the game's description. We learn it is in fact a descendant, and is ancient in the more common use of the term, as a dragon that outlasted Gwyn's crusade against them and outlived many of its peers. As Kalameet is a dragon found within the past of the game, naturally its adoptive features are much closer to the everlasting dragons than say the modern drakes of the main game or the dragons that have malformed over time. We of course can battle Kalameet to end its terrorizing streak if we seek counsel from the Hawkeye Goth, a missionary of Gwyn's own quartet of knights sent alongside Artorias to aid in his journey towards Manus. Goth, a seasoned dragon slayer who won many commendations during the Great Age of Ancients and the war against the true everlasting dragons, can make quick work of the dragon's flight, but in doing so offers some context as to who Kalameet was. He refers to Kalameet by name and suggests Kalameet has been known to Anor Londo for a while. His rampage may have extended beyond Ulasil but was consistently ignored as Anor Londo itself feared it would exhaust far too many resources to take the dragon down, as they were far more concerned with tackling Manus, a much greater and more existential threat to the Age of Fire entirely. However, upon taking a sidebar and once brought to a place of flightlessness, we can battle Kalameet and are given context as to how Kalameet was able to strike such a reputation amongst even a city built on the foundation of dragon slaying, as Kalameet is far more unique than just an ordinary dragon. He harbours an ability known as the Curse of Calamity, a special draconic curse that inflicts immense pain to those in its way. Dark Souls 3 furthers the context of Kalameet's power from the Ring of Calamity obtained by revering a statue of an ancient dragon, and suggests this power may have been an ancient source of strength related to everlasting dragons that have since gone extinct. Kalameet's flame is unique too, carrying a darkened feature that suggests the abyss native to Ulasil may have only empowered Kalameet further. This absorption of darkness and humanity from a dragon is again explored further in the third game with the existence of Midir, a captive dragon taken by Gwyn during the War of Ancients due to its ability to consume and absorb elements of the dark, essentially offering Gwyn a means to control and contain it. Nevertheless, with Kalameet slain, we can of course return to our mission at hand, and thus to return to Ulasil's garden we can follow a path that leads us to a Colosseum of sorts, but prior to this we make acquaintance with a uniquely dressed character known only as Marvelous Chester. Naturally, finding a human character in the past world of Lordran means Chester holds a very unique place amongst all other characters we meet who are bound to the undead prophecy. From our encounter we learn Chester, much like the player, has been dragged into the past by Manus. His armour is described as exquisitely made and his crossbow as originating from Karim. This is an immensely important note as Karim came far after the events of the first Age of Fire this DLC takes place in. Dark Souls content creator Zully the Witch, in a great video that's worth checking out, demonstrates that Chester's design is likely a nod to both From Software's past and present design ideology, sharing from Yharnam in its future creation of Bloodborne, but also from Demon Souls Boletaria, its previous game. Although this doesn't mean he's from either universe or that they are indeed connected, it reveals the truth that Chester is alien to the Dark Souls universe we are familiar with, and that he may come from a section of the timeline in a place we never get to visit. It's most likely he represents a future version of Karim that took on Gothic and Victorian archetypes. We get further reinforcement of this theory as we learn Chester had entered Ulasil in a way not dissimilar to us. He started his journey through the sanctuary as we have ourselves, even having spoken to Elizabeth in identical conditions, something verified by both Elizabeth and Chester himself. This suggests we may not have been the only character to have been grabbed into the past by Manus, and Chester may have come from a time far after the events of Dark Souls 1 proper. From Chester's armour, we learn during his life in this future version of Karim, he was a decorated sniper. His armour goes on further to paint the image of an aristocrat or potentially an assassin too. Again, his armour itself is nothing like we've seen in the Dark Souls games universe, and may be relative to a time in Dark Souls that we either miss between the trilogies or is left out from the core events of each installment. If provoked, Chester literally fights us in a style that feels so far from the Dark Souls formula, it can give credence to Crockpot theories that he originates from a different game entirely. He engages in fighting mechanics unseen by human characters. Moving on from our flamboyant time traveller, we are finally given an audience with Artorias, the legendary warrior of Gwyn's quartet of knights, at the tail end of his life, having already lost to Manus and been corrupted by Manus's darkness, inducing a madness that has him aimlessly flailing against anything he now perceives as a threat. I won't go over Artorias' story again, as a whole chapter of this video already covered his great campaign, but what is worth talking about here is that Artorias' story arc from great ambitious champion fighting against the dark, and then corrupted knight unable to see past his own madness, flailing against anything he perceives as darkness, is one that echoes throughout the trilogy. We know this legacy is most relevant to the watchdogs of Farron Covenant in the third game, where a knightly discipline would be erected in his legacy, and from them a group of champions known as the Abyss Walkers would inherit the First Flame and overthrow the rising darkened threat of Karthus, only to find themselves battling the darkness within themselves in a maddened rage during the main timeline. However, unlike the Abyss Watchers in Dark Souls 3, Artorias is not keen on fighting himself, and thus we have to confront him alone. Eventually, upon his death, we are finally granted access to the epicenter of Manus' rage, Ulasil's township. However, before we go any further, and after catching our own breath at the nearest bonfire, we can find a peculiar woman adorned in blue cloth, having erected a gravestone for the now fallen Artorias. On approach, she thanks us for the kindness of offering Artorias his rest, and introduces herself to us as Karan. This is the very Karan once responsible for the aforementioned Lord's Blade group that were directly associated with Gwyn's covert operations, a specialised task force made up of women who conducted assassinations and highly important domestic affairs. Karan clearly had a close relationship to Artorias and couldn't bring herself to kill him. Karan doesn't tell us much else, and this may be due to some contempt she had towards humans, using a condescending tone when we aggravate her. However, despite her contempt towards humanity, likely due to her proximity to Gwyn and of course being a god herself, she extends her gratitude by offering us two iconic blades, the Gold and Silver Tracer. The Tracers themselves in Dark Souls 1 are described sparingly, referring to them as giving the Lord's Blades an iconic dancing fighting style. However, we do get a throwback to this fighting style during the events of Dark Souls 3, and particularly against the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Without jumping too far ahead of ourselves, we learn the Dancer of the Boreal Valley may share these design traits to the Lord's Blades, as she was a spoil of war for the great Pontiff Sullivan after his successful coup of Anor Londo during the events of the final game. The Dancer of the Boreal Valley is described as a member of Anor Londo's royalty, suggesting Karan, or perhaps the Lord's Blades generally, may have retained great influence in Anor Londo far after the events of Gwyn's First Age of Fire, and may have even continued to operate during Gwyndolin's rule over the territory, becoming great enough to breed royalty into Anor Londo through the ages. In any case, side tangents aside, we can continue on with our mission and enter Ulasil's township, ready to confront what remained of the city and Manus' growing threat of the Abyss. From the offset, the extent to which Ulasil's population has been corrupted is clear. The regular human denizens have been transformed into bloatheads, their humanity having been forcefully corrupted to mimic Manus' own rage. We learn below the township resided the Abyss, the very same place the furtive pygmy once went to rest and await the end of the Age of Fire, to allow for a peaceful transition into the Age of Man, an age that would precede the Age of Fire, synonymous with the rule of gods. However, as we have discussed earlier, it would be Gwyn's action to bind humanity to the dark sign by tricking the pygmy lords of the Ring City that would set in sequence the events of the furtive pygmy's transformation from a peaceful, secretive and shy being into one enveloped with rage, as Manus, upon being informed of Gwyn's trickery by the primordial serpent Karth, would see Gwyn's actions as having betrayed the same process of natural cycles that Gwyn once benefited from himself during the Age of Ancients. It's inferred the furtive pygmy during the early days when the souls of the lords were found at the revelation of the first flame aided Gwyn in the creation of the Age of Fire, with the promise that when the Age of Fire inevitably waned, the Age of Men would come to be, and Gwyn's actions to bind the Dark Soul was an intentional subversion of nature, an intentional slight against the pygmies and thus humans who once fought beside the Fiery Lords. Despite the furtive pygmy having divested much of his soul to his pygmy children, he still held the greater portion of the Dark Soul, and thus greater control over humans despite the Dark Sign curse. It's in this, the furtive pygmy, once transformed by his rage, would not only transform the furtive pygmy's own body into that of Manus, but also inevitably transform humans that bear a portion of the Dark Soul, aka humanity, to also be sent into a rage-filled form echoing Manus's anger, as Manus is, and will always be, their true father. The bloatheads are the result of this transformation by proxy, but the most interesting of the transformations are of course related to the bloathead sorcerers. It's indicated these sorcerers were once the mystics of Ulasil that practice golden sorcery. This existing proficiency in golden sorcery would allow them to transform into beings that could now make use of a very different type of sorcery altogether, a sorcery that drew from the rage inherent to their own humanity, a sorcery linked intimately to Manus's new form and what it meant to be a human in this new era. Ulasil would thus become the place we can point to as uncovering the potential for this form of sorcery altogether. In Dark Souls 2, we learn from the story related to Galea that the knowledge and use of dark sorcery may have been vanquished entirely if not for the actions of a wandering sorcerer known as Galea. Little is said of Galea, but it is suggested he either resided within Ulasil during the events of Manus, or perhaps was linked to someone who had done previously, and thus would be the primary reason dark sorceries would continue on throughout the greater world, taught back to the general population as dark miracles, retellings of Manus's corruption in a similar breath to how miracles in the traditional format are retellings of Gwyn's power. We'll explore further what was made of dark sorcery in the events of Dark Souls 2, but it does help us build out the country of Ulasil as being far more infected than just the areas we're able to visit. Reckoning with the bloatheads will finally lead our character all the way down into the abyss that sat under Ulasil. This area is immensely unique and important to the Dark Souls trilogy, as it may be the rawest form of humanity and thus darkness we can explore in the entire trilogy. Making our way through this abyss has us reckon with literal living sprites of humanity. These sprites only ever show up again in the Ring City, the same place that hosted the other great portion of the Dark Soul through the Pygmy Lords who carried the furtive Pygmy's devolved soul, and resided in the territory forcefully isolated from the world proper. However, comparatively, even the Ring City doesn't host such a concentrated darkness where living humanity sprites roam aimlessly in their hundreds. This of course makes clear the furtive pygmy, now known as Manus, is with no shadow of a doubt still the greatest amalgamation of the Dark Soul itself, far greater than all the pygmies of the Ring City that were once used to capture humanity in the Dark Sign. These sprites of humanity are not offensive beings, they are purely gravitational, slowly edging closer to the player character. While initially we can brush this off as purely gameplay mechanics to make the area dynamically difficult, in truth it's a way for the game to show us that these sprites of humanity are not drawn to us to fight us, they are in fact drawn to us to merge as one, as we are, as Karth had informed us, of the Dark Soul. Men are beings of the dark, and thus we will forever be drawn to darkness for this very reason. These sprites may explain how the residents of Ulasil had their own humanity warped by Manus's anger, as these sprites originate from the furtive pygmy's rage as Manus, and are pleading with humans to join in Manus's rage against Gwyn's transgressions before it is too late. We eventually do make it through the abyss, and soon enough we fall to its lowest level, ready to face our progenitor, Manus himself. Manus, as you'd expect, is far from the image of the furtive pygmy we originally are made familiar with in the introductory cutscene. In this form, it's clear he has rescinded his furtive and pygmy form. He is no longer holding the secret of his dark soul, nor is he contained in the body of a patient being. He is ready to take Gwyn to task for his subversion of nature, his choice to burden humanity with a curse in a selfish attempt to retain the Age of Fire permanently. This moment perhaps represents the most concentrated version of the Dark Soul we face, likely only beaten by the form Gale takes at the literal end of the world in Dark Souls 3. Reckoning with Manus is a battle against the explosive rage of a lord once on par with Gwyn during the Age of Ancients. Manus violently projects the Dark Soul in an attempt to subdue us, and if we're able to reckon with our own humanity being malformed by pure darkness and the bludgeoning strength of the Abyss, we can fell the mighty beast and from it shatter the unity of his own Dark Soul into fragments that will spread across the world. The death of Manus eventually leads to the rescue of Dusk and of course the threat of Ulasil's Abyss being addressed for the Age of Fire. However, unbeknownst to all involved, Manus's Dark Soul would be powerful enough to breed new lives of its own, and while its unity is disrupted, even tiny fragments of his darkness would transform into the Dark Sisters that would come to dominate the narrative of Dark Souls 2. Of course, we'll detail that in the next video. But for now, we can put the Abyss to rest and return to our undead prophecy. With Manus dead, we can travel back to our own timeline and finally bring back Gwyn's devolved soul, Nito's soul of death, and Izalith's soul of chaos to the First Flame, and harness for ourselves the power of the Lords to form a power not dissimilar to Gwyn's when he sacrificed himself to the First Flame. And in doing so, the gates to the kiln of the First Flame is opened, and our path to the primal bonfire is laid out in front of us. As we walk towards the First Flame, we are given a deep foreshadowing of what this cycle will come to mean to the greater world. Our path is laden in ash accumulated from Gwyn's first sacrifice. This ash, of course, would come to represent a world of stagnation in Dark Souls 3. The ash, while currently resigned to this small part of the world, will soon envelop the continent to remind the world this fire-linking cycle is anything but natural, and soon it will be impossible to hide away its inherent contradictions. But for now we march on, and behind the mist towards the kiln proper, we are greeted by a dwindled Gwyn, the architect of the Age of Fire and the once sung about hero of the war against the everlasting dragons. This battle was never intended to be difficult. The difficulty was always going to be our journey to get here. Gwyn, in his current state, having divested his soul before reaching the kiln and having been burned to a state of hollowing, ironically not unlike the humans he damned on his route here, is in many ways a mirror of what we will become when we follow the path he laid out for us. So sterilized is Gwyn in these moments, he can't even conjure the sunlight spears he was most known for, and in its place is a waning flame. He no longer represents sunlight, he only represents the remnant cinders of the First Flame, forcing it to remain far past its intended expiry date. With Gwyn having sacrificed his own life force to the First Flame and entropy having dwindled it thin, we now, having galvanized the souls of his devolved soul in Seath and the Four Kings, but also the souls of his peers in Izalith and Nito, can strike a merciful death to Gwyn and will be presented with two options. The path of least resistance, the path laid out by Gwyn and Framt, would have us shoulder Gwyn's Age of Fire and renew the world anew, commencing a third Age of Fire and cementing the cycle of humanity having to bear the sacrifices to preserve an age built on their subjugation. However, for those who had been forewarned by Karth may have realised there is, of course, another option. The choice to turn their back on the First Flame entirely and allow the Age of Fire to wane into absolute redundancy. While this may seem to undo Gwyn's sin, Gwyn had already set in motion a world where humans could not materially live in a world absent of the First Flame, as their humanity had been inextricably connected to the First Flame, and in due time, if our champion is to neglect the First Flame, eventually they too will fade into obscurity until another undead does rise unknowing of Gwyn's subversion of nature and rekindle the First Flame, driven by the stories of the undead prophecy and a chance to undo hollowing altogether. Thus, whatever option we choose in this last moment, Dark Souls 1 cements the binary of the world we'll become more familiar with in the next installments. A binary that will be canonized as the inevitable plight all must endure due to Gwyn's slight against nature, an action Uldir will canonize as the first sin and the eventual death spiral of this world entirely. Eons will pass and the torch of the Lord of Cinder will make its way through countless undead champions and countless new eras and kingdoms. But one thing remains certain. While ashes will accumulate with each cycle, stories of immense resilience will become the backbone for a future where one human will rise as a true champion to bring an end to Gwyn's contradictions by assisting in the creation of a new world entirely. Until then, we're left with just the lost stories of the eras in between. And while most are lost to history, one story would surface that will come to represent these lost eras. This, of course, being the story of Drang Lake and the subject of our next journey.